Good evening. Before you close your eyes tonight, take a long, slow breath. Let your body soften against the bed. Feel the weight of the blankets resting over you, warm and safe. Now, let your mind wander not forward into tomorrow, but backward, far backward, to another world. A world without electricity, without radiators or down comforters. A world where winter was not just a season, but a test of survival. Tonight, we drift back to the Middle Ages, to the small, humble homes scattered across the European countryside, to a time when candles flickered like stars in the smoky air and the walls were made of mud, straw, and patience, to the quiet, enduring people who lived within them, the medieval peasants. They were not knights or nobles, nor kings or queens. No songs were written for them, no statues raised in their honor. Yet they were the true keepers of endurance, the silent guardians of life during the coldest, darkest months of the year. Every night was a battle, every morning a small victory. They survived not by might or riches, but through resilience, resourcefulness, and the unbreakable rhythm of the human spirit. Picture the world they knew, the wind howling like a ghost outside, the moonlight seeping through cracks in the roof, the frost creeping along the windows like silver lace. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the scent of burning wood. The fire at the center of the home was more than warmth. It was life itself. Its glow was hope. Its crackle, comfort. And around it, huddled together for warmth, were families who had learned to make peace with the cold. Mothers wrapped in wool and linen, fathers still smelling faintly of soil and sweat, children tucked like kittens under rough blankets of straw and cloth. Even the animals, goats, pigs, and chickens, shared the same breath of air, the same fragile warmth, all creatures bound by one goal: to endure. Winter, for the medieval peasant, was not a passing inconvenience. It was an adversary that demanded cleverness and courage. There were no thermostats to turn, no glass windows to shut out the night. Heat had to be earned, one ember at a time. Comfort had to be invented from whatever could be found: an extra cloak, a patch of moss, a handful of straw stuffed between the cracks in the wall. And yet, there was something almost sacred in that struggle, a rhythm that spoke to something deep within us: the need to adapt, to persist, to keep a small light burning even when the world around us grows dark. Imagine now that you are there. Outside, the snow drifts high against the doorway. The night is heavy with silence. Inside, a single fire glows low in the hearth, painting the faces of those who sleep around it in amber light. The shadows move slowly, like old memories, and the air hums with the soft sound of breathing. The walls creak as if whispering secrets. A log shifts in the embers, and a small flame stirs awake, sending a gentle wave of warmth into the room. The people in this tiny home do not dream of grand castles or feasts. Their dreams are simpler, softer: the hope of a mild dawn, a loaf of bread, a dry roof. They measure happiness not by wealth, but by warmth. And perhaps, in that simplicity, they find a kind of peace we have long forgotten. You can almost hear the world outside their walls: the crunch of frozen earth, the soft hoot of an owl, the distant cry of wind threading through the trees. Everything slows down here. Time moves like a sleeping heartbeat, steady and quiet. The peasant's world was harsh, yes, but it was also deeply human. Every task, every small act of care: feeding the fire, tucking a child closer, mending a hole in the thatch, was a quiet declaration of love and endurance. Their strength was not loud or visible. It lived in their hands, in their breath, in the steady will to keep going when the night stretched endlessly long. It was the same strength that still flickers in us, hidden beneath the hum of modern life. The same spirit that once turned a pile of straw into a bed, a handful of ash into a spark, a frozen world into a home. So, as you lie here, wrapped in warmth and quiet, Imagine that distant world breathing softly beside you. Imagine the peasant woman, her hands rough from work but gentle as she banks the fire for the night. The old man who tells a story in the half dark, his voice slow and low, keeping the children awake just long enough to forget the cold. The young boy dreaming of spring, of green fields and sunlight, and days when the frost will melt into rivers again. They do not know it, but they are the ancestors of our comfort. Every modern blanket, every glowing lamp, every heated home is built upon their endurance. They taught the world how to survive when it was at its coldest, how to keep the flame alive even when the wind tried to snuff it out. And though centuries have passed, their spirit still lingers in the soft hush of winter nights, in the glow of every fireplace, in the human need to gather close and share warmth. The peasants were not just survivors of the cold, they were teachers of it. They understood that warmth is more than temperature, it is connection. It is shared breath, shared laughter, shared hope. It is what makes a home out of hardship, what makes the longest winter bearable. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember them not with pity, but with quiet admiration. Let their story unfold like a lullaby in your mind. Let the rhythm of their simple, patient lives wrap around you like a blanket. They were the nameless, the forgotten, the countless souls who endured without applause. They built their lives on endurance, faith, and love, the oldest kind of strength there is. And as the firelight fades in that faraway cottage, and the snow falls softly against the roof, listen closely. You can almost hear the whisper of their world, calling across the centuries, telling you, you too are stronger than the cold. Now, close your eyes. Let the wind outside your window fade to a murmur. Let the story carry you back through time, into the quiet heart of winter, where human warmth burned brighter than any Sunday. And when you sleep, dream softly of them, the peasants of the medieval world, the unsung heroes of endurance, whose strength, like an ember in the dark, still glows quietly within us all. The fire crackles softly, and the world outside your window grows quiet. You've already met our humble heroes, the medieval peasants, masters of survival and accidental poets of endurance. Now, let's step a little closer, through the smoke of time, into their homes. Be careful where you tread. The floor is not wood, not stone, but packed earth. It sighs under your weight. And the air, oh, it bites. It's easy to picture the Middle Ages as a tapestry of knights and castles, of ladies in silk gowns gazing from towers, of feasts with roasted boars and golden goblets. The imagination loves glamour. It skips past the mud and the cold. But tonight, we won't skip. We'll stay right here, in the heart of winter, where there are no trumpets, no feasts, only the rhythm of breath and the sound of wind pushing at the door. Forget the stone keeps of kings. Our story takes place in a hut so small you could stretch your arms and almost touch both walls. The peasants' homes were not built for beauty. They were built for survival, and barely that. Walls of wattle and daub, woven sticks plastered with mud, straw, and animal dung, roofs thatched with reeds that whispered in the wind. From a distance, they looked almost cozy little mounds of earth wearing hats of straw. But up close, the illusion fades. The wind slips through the cracks like a sly ghost. The floor weeps with dampness. The ceiling sighs when snow piles heavy on top. And when the fire dies, the temperature inside drops to the same as the world outside. It wasn't uncommon for a puddle to form in the corner, or for frost to bloom inside the house like a white flower. The walls were cold to the touch, and sometimes the very air sparkled with tiny crystals that danced in the light of the hearth. Romantic? Perhaps, if you weren't living in it. But for those who did, it was an unending negotiation between life and the elements. Let's imagine a night in that world. The day's last light fades, and the village sinks into shadow. There are no street lamps, No glow of windows, only the occasional flicker of a distant hearth, faint and trembling against the darkness. Inside one hut, a family gathers close around a fire, no bigger than a loaf of bread. It sputters, spits, and sighs. The wood is damp. It hisses more than it burns. They talk quietly, voices low and slow, as if speaking too loudly might blow out the flame. Outside, the wind howls through the thatch. The door, a single plank of uneven wood, groans and rattles like an old man's chest. The mother adjusts a shawl around her shoulders, wool so coarse it could polish metal. The father pokes the fire with a stick, hoping it will catch, muttering under his breath. The children sit wrapped in rags and old blankets that smell of smoke, sweat, and sheep. Their faces glow orange in the firelight, eyes wide and heavy with sleep. There is a kind of holiness in their stillness. Each movement is deliberate, each breath measured, because in this world, warmth is a fragile miracle, easily lost, and yet, somehow, they endure. You see, winter was not a visitor in the medieval countryside. It was a ruler, absolute, merciless, and deeply respected. When it arrived, people didn't fight it. They bowed their heads and made peace. They sealed their homes with mud and cloth, patched the thatch with frozen fingers, and whispered to each other, "Just get through the next moon. Just hold on." Every task became part of a ritual survival disguised as routine. But do not think it was all misery. Humans, after all, are stubbornly good at finding small joys. A warm crust of bread baked near the coals, the laughter of a neighbor whose roof still leaked worse than yours, the strange comfort of knowing that everyone, rich and poor alike, could see their breath in the morning air. Still, there were nights when even laughter froze. Imagine lying down to sleep. The straw bed crunches beneath you, the scent of hay mingling with smoke and damp wool. The fire is a faint red glow now, like the last ember of a dream. You pull your blanket tighter, though it's little more than a patchwork of rags. The air burns your nose when you breathe. Your breath rises in soft white clouds and vanishes. Somewhere nearby, a chicken stirs, rustling its feathers. You curl into yourself, tucking your hands beneath your chest, hoping to trap a little of your own heat. And, as you drift towards sleep, you hear it, that small, steady sound. The wind finding its way through the cracks, whistling softly across the floor. It's like a lullaby, if lullabies could sting your skin. There's humor in it too. In that cruel way nature sometimes teases. The moment you think you've found a comfortable spot, a cold breeze tickles your feet. When you shift away, it finds your neck instead. It's as if the house itself is alive and mischievous, reminding you who's truly in charge. The medieval peasant's winter home was not a fortress, it was a sieve with a soul. And yet, it kept them alive, mostly. The huts were small, yes, but small was useful. A large space meant more air to heat, more drafts to chase away. Sometimes, two families shared one hut, or 3 generations huddled together, because warmth shared was warmth multiplied. Even their animals, cows, goats, chickens, slept inside. Not for companionship, though that might have come anyway, but for body heat. A cow gives off more warmth than a fireplace, and though the smell was memorable, it was a small price to pay for survival. Let's linger a moment on that smell. Imagine the air thick with smoke, sweat, wet straw, and the faint, ever-present tang of manure. It's unpleasant at first, yes, but after a while it becomes invisible, just another layer of life. The medieval nose was not delicate, it was well-trained, and perhaps there's something oddly comforting about that mix of earth and fire and life, all tangled together in one humble room. When the storm raged outside, when snow piled high against the door, the peasant hut became a universe of its own. A tiny, flickering world where warmth was sacred, conversation slow, and the hours stretched endlessly long. In that dim, smoky space, Families told stories, mended clothes, and shared stews so thick you could stand a spoon upright in them. Outside, the cold clawed at the walls, but inside there was laughter, the kind that came not from comfort but defiance. Because, in truth, the medieval peasant's life was not romantic. There were no golden sunsets over shining fields, no chivalric melodies drifting through the night. Their reality was far humbler and far more human. They lived close to the earth, to its moods, to its cruelties. Every breath of warm air was a gift, every loaf of bread a triumph. They didn't expect comfort. They didn't dream of luxury. They dreamed of enough firewood to last the week, enough food to fill the children's bellies, enough daylight to mend what had broken. And somehow, in that endless cycle of cold and endurance, they found a kind of peace, the peace that comes when you stop asking the world to be easy and instead learn to live inside its difficulty. Perhaps that's the most enduring secret of their world. They were not waiting for warmth to return. They were learning how to live without it. Now, if you listen closely, you can still hear echoes of their nights. The sigh of the wind through the thatch, the faint shuffle of feet on cold earth, the quiet murmur of a prayer before sleep. It is the sound of humanity at its simplest, its rawest, and its most beautiful. Because even in those bitter winters, even when the night seemed endless, they never stopped building fires. They never stopped gathering close. They never stopped hoping that spring would come again. And it always did, eventually. So when you think of the Middle Ages, don't picture the castle walls or the shining armor. Picture this instead: a family, their faces soft in the glow of a small fire, their hands joined, their laughter muffled by wool and smoke. A baby breathing softly against its mother's chest. A man whispering to his wife that the woodpile will last another night, though he knows it won't. This is the real heart of medieval life, the quiet courage of ordinary people, wrapped in rags, holding the line against the cold. It's not glamorous, no, but it's honest. And when you look past the mud, the smoke, the aching cold, you'll find something shining there, not gold, not glory, but warmth. The warmth of human endurance, the warmth of us. And so, as the fire fades and the night deepens, our story continues. The peasants will soon teach us their tricks, how to coax flame from dying embers, how to turn straw and mud into comfort, how to make the unlivable somehow livable. For now, rest in this moment. Listen to the soft breathing of those who came before us. Their world was harsh, yes, but their hearts were unbreakable. The night lingers, the wind sighs through the thatch, a low, hollow hum that might almost be mistaken for singing. Inside the hut, the fire dwindles to a sleepy glow, the color of old honey. You'd think that after a while, the peasants might have grown used to the cold, but no one truly gets used to it. You only learn to live alongside it, the way one lives with a difficult neighbor, politely, carefully, and with the occasional curse whispered under one's breath. In the quiet darkness, warmth was not a guarantee, it was a performance. A nightly drama where every scrap of cloth and ember had a role to play. And the costumes, well, they were something to behold. Let's start with clothing. Forget silk tunics, shining armor, or the elegant velvets of noble courts. The medieval peasant's wardrobe was more textured. Wool was their closest friend and also their worst enemy, scratchy, heavy, and as forgiving as a nettle patch. Most peasants owned one main outfit, sometimes two if they were lucky. It was not washed often, not because they didn't care for hygiene, but because washing meant water, and water meant cold hands and frozen cloth that took days to dry. So the layers of winter clothing were not just garments, they were time capsules of the season. A faint scent of smoke, a sprinkle of hay dust, and, inevitably, the lingering perfume of goat. Ah, yes, the goat, the unofficial fashion icon of the medieval countryside. Wool cloaks and sheepskin mantles were often rubbed with animal fat to repel moisture, a trick that worked surprisingly well, though it left the wearer smelling faintly like a stew. To a peasant, this scent was normal, even comforting. It was the smell of survival, of belonging, of warmth fought for and earned. If a noble passed by, they might wrinkle their nose, but the peasant would shrug and pull their cloak tighter. After all, no perfume could match the luxury of still having your fingers by spring. The layering system was rudimentary but ingenious. Linen against the skin, wool over that, sometimes a coarse cloak on top. And if the cold bit too sharply, they added whatever else could be found, rags, sacks, even straw stuffed under clothing. They didn't call it fashion, of course, but if there had been a runway in the 13th century, the look might be described as desperate rustic chic. And so, and yet, for all this effort, the warmth never seemed to last. The wind always found a way in through sleeves, collars, gaps in the seams. The clothes became stiff with frost in the mornings, and when they thawed by the fire, the smell was a fierce thing to behold. But no one complained much. The cold was a shared burden, and besides, complaining took energy, and energy meant warmth. Better to laugh about it, or to tell a story while you rubbed your hands together and pretended the numbness was fading. When the day's work was done, and the last log had been coaxed into glowing, there came the next challenge: sleep. To sleep was to surrender, but also to risk it, because in winter, sleep could steal you away if you weren't careful. Beds, if they could be called that, were simple things. Wooden frames filled with straw, sometimes raised off the ground, but often not. The straw had to be changed regularly, lest it turn moldy or welcome unwelcome guests. And those guests, the fleas, the bed bugs, the tiny armies of the medieval mattress, they were constant companions. A peasant might wake not from the cold, but from the itch of 1,000 minuscule explorers marching across their skin. But what could they do? The straw was warmth, of a kind. It trapped heat and life. Each rustle was the sound of existence itself, scratching, breathing, surviving. In the darkness, a child might whisper, "Mama, there's something in my bed." And the mother, half asleep, might murmur, "Then you're not alone, love." A strange comfort, perhaps, but comfort nonetheless. The beds were shared too: husband, wife, children, sometimes even grandparents, all tucked close together, a pile of human heat beneath coarse blankets. The air in the room was thick and smoky, the kind that left your throat rough and your eyes watering. But if you pressed close enough, if you found the right crook of an arm or shoulder, you might find a pocket of warmth that felt like heaven itself. It was not uncommon to wake with frost on the inside of the walls, or to find your own breath hanging above you like mist. Sometimes the water in the bucket froze solid overnight, and the first task of morning was to break the ice and pretend it was refreshing. Yet even this ritual held a kind of pride. Each morning survived was a quiet declaration: we're still here. There's something primal about the way cold moves through a room, silent, invisible, yet relentless. The peasants knew it intimately. They spoke of it as if it were alive, a thing with moods and teeth. They would say, "The frost is angry tonight," or "The wind is hunting." And truly, it was a hunter patient, cunning, always looking for the smallest crack in the wall, the tiniest unguarded patch of skin. Frostbite was not a concept they named, it was a thing they endured. Fingers blackened, toes stiffened, ears burned, and then felt nothing at all. A farmer might lose a few fingertips one winter, a shepherd a toe or two, and still they carried on. Because there was no doctor, no medicine, only the simple knowledge that to stop moving was to stop living. And then there was the other danger, the quiet one that came in the night: hypothermia, though they didn't have that word either. They called it the cold sleep, and they feared it like a ghost. A person might go to bed exhausted, curled beside the fire and simply not wake. Their body cooled, their breath slowed, and the frost took them gently, like a lover who meant no harm. The others would find them in the morning, peaceful, as if dreaming, and they would whisper prayers, light a small candle, and carry on. Because in the Middle Ages, life and death were neighbors too, sharing the same hearth, yet for every tragedy, there were 100 small victories. The nights survived, the fires kept alive, the fingers still intact by spring. Every morning was a triumph, every sunrise a quiet cheer. When the first bird sang again in February, the peasants smiled at one another as though they had won a war because, in a way, they had. Now, before the melancholy grows too heavy, remember this. Medieval peasants, for all their hardship, were rarely humorless. When the nights grew unbearable, someone always found a joke to share. Perhaps about a neighbor who fell asleep too close to the fire and woke with singed hair, or the time someone's cow snuck under the bed for warmth and refused to come out until morning. Laughter was warmth too invisible, weightless, but real. A story told well could make the cold retreat, at least for a while. There's a strange beauty in that kind of humor, not the bright, easy kind, but the deep laughter that comes from people who have learned to live with struggle. They laughed not because life was kind, but because it wasn't. And laughter, to them, was defiance. Each chuckle a spark, each smile a small rebellion against the endless winter. So, picture it now. A family, wrapped in their goat-scented cloaks, sitting on straw that crunches like old parchment. The wind rattles the door, snow drifts down the chimney, and someone, maybe the father, tells a story about a man who tried to sleep standing up to keep his feet from freezing. The children giggle, the mother shakes her head. The fire pops approvingly, and for a moment, the room feels warmer. In those long months of darkness, the nights were endless, stretching out like old cloth, soft and threadbare. The peasants measured time not by clocks, but by the turning of the moon, by the sound of the rooster, by the weight of the cold itself. And though each night was a test, each morning proved something extraordinary about the human spirit, because for all the misery, the aching bones, the frozen toes, the sleepless hours beside the dying fire they endured, they always endured, not through comfort or convenience, but through sheer will and quiet courage. They didn't have insulation, but they had each other. They didn't have central heating, but they had the art of huddling close. And in that closeness, in that shared breath and heartbeat, there was something powerful, something warmer than any flame. If you listen closely, even now, you can hear their ghosts in the wind, not haunting, but humming. A rhythm of endurance, of laughter and struggle, of small lives lived bravely in the face of the cold. They whisper the same message over and over. You are stronger than you think. The night is long, but it will end. And so the peasants survived another winter frostbitten, weary, smelling faintly of goats and smoke, but undefeated. Their huts still stood, their children still laughed, their fires still burned. And when the thaw came, when the ice cracked and the first shoots of green appeared, they stepped outside, blinked in the sunlight, and smiled, because they had done it again. They had outlasted the cold. The morning light arrives slowly, thin and pale as watered milk. It leaks through cracks in the wall, brushes the sleeping faces, and paints the air in silver dust. Somewhere outside, a rooster clears its throat and thinks better of it. The world is frozen still. Inside the cottage, you can see your breath curl in the air before it disappears, a ghost that's already given up. This is home, and though home might conjure an image of comfort in the medieval countryside, it meant something far more practical and far less glamorous. The peasant's house was not a fortress against nature. It was a truce, a fragile agreement made from mud, sticks, and prayer. Step closer, and you'll see the bones of it, the humble craft known as wattle and daub. To modern eyes, it might seem charming, a kind of rustic puzzle of branches, mud, and straw, like something from a fairy tale. But to those who built it, it was simply the cheapest way to keep the wind from taking your soup. The construction was an act of faith. First came the wattle, thin, pliable branches, woven together like the ribs of a basket. Then the daub, a sticky blend of mud, straw, and yes, animal dung pressed over it by hand. Children often helped, their small fingers perfect for squishing the mixture into the gaps. It was messy work, and the smell could linger for days. But when the wall dried under the sun, it hardened into something that almost resembled strength. Almost. Because no matter how carefully it was done, the daub always cracked. The wind always found a seam. And when the rains came, the lower parts of the walls softened, melting slightly, so that sometimes, by spring, your home looked like it was trying to return itself politely to the earth. Still, it worked. For all its flaws, this mixture of mud and manure was a masterpiece of necessity. The dung wasn't just filler, it was insulation, glue, and waterproofing all in one. Nature's version of modern plasterboard. It kept the cold from cutting too deep, the damp from spreading too far. And if you could ignore the smell, and after a while, everyone did, it felt almost cozy. There's a certain irony to it, isn't there? The same material you spent all day shoveling out of the barn became the very thing that sheltered you at night. A circle of life, quite literally. Let's linger for a moment on dung. It's not the most elegant topic, but in medieval times, it was the unsung hero of survival. Dung was fuel, dung was insulation, dung was life. When mixed with straw, it became surprisingly effective at holding warmth. Spread thin on the floor and left to dry, it hardened into a surface that didn't soak up every spill or leak. Some even used it to seal their roofs, smearing a thin layer beneath the thatch to block drafts. And when all else failed, it could be burned slowly, smokily, but with just enough heat to warm a pot of broth or dry a pair of soaked boots. The scent of burning dung hung over villages like an earthy perfume, the smell of perseverance. Peasants didn't flinch at it. To them, it meant warmth. It meant survival. It meant dinner might still be edible. Humor became the only dignified response. You can't eat gold, they'd say, but you can build with dung. And in a world where winters outlasted optimism, that was wisdom worth repeating. Now, look up. The roof is a patchwork of thatch, long, dry reeds tied in bundles and layered thick. From below, it looks soft, like an overgrown bird's nest. It's beautiful in its own way, but don't be fooled. When the rain comes, the thatch sings. It rustles, sighs, and inevitably leaks. No roof was perfect. Drips were part of the domestic soundtrack, joining the chorus of creaks and crackles. The peasants knew exactly where each leak lived. They arranged their possessions, few though they were, in safe corners, away from the steady drops that could, over time, carve grooves into wooden tables or the backs of their hands. In the worst storms, the roof would shift slightly, sending bits of straw tumbling down like golden snow. A child might giggle. An old man might mutter, "The roof's blessing us again." And then, with weary resignation, someone would fetch another handful of rushes, climb up a ladder, and patch it by candlelight. It was the same story with the walls. They weren't solid barriers, but living, breathing things, expanding, cracking, settling with every change in the weather. In winter, they grew damp and cold. In summer, they exhaled a faint smell of earth and smoke. It was like living inside a creature that sighed and groaned along with you. As for the floor, well, it began as dirt. And most of the time, it ended that way too. Some households laid down straw or rushes to soften the ground, but within days, it mixed with mud, food scraps, and the occasional chicken feather. The result was a strange, spongy carpet that crackled when dry and squelched when wet. But it was familiar, and familiarity, in hard times, is its own kind of comfort. You might imagine the peasants as downtrodden, but they were, in truth, remarkable engineers, masters of making do. When a wall cracked, they didn't despair. They grabbed whatever came to hand: a rag, a piece of moss, a clump of clay, an old shirt. Anything soft or squishy was fair game. The phrase peasant insulation could have filled a book of inventions. Sometimes they stuffed gaps with bits of sheep's wool. Other times they jammed old cloth into the holes, sealing them with animal fat or tallow. If you walked into one of these homes, you might see little tufts of fabric and moss poking out of the walls like the fur of a sleeping beast. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. And when the wind whistled through anyway, they just whistled back. That was the heart of it all, resilience mixed with humor. A medieval peasant didn't dream of perfection. They dreamed of enough. Enough to keep the wind from stealing their breath. Enough to make it through one more winter. Every repair, every patch, every handful of mud slapped onto the wall was an act of faith. This will hold. This will last. And sometimes it did. There were cottages that stood for decades lopsided, patched, and leaning like tired men, but still standing. Each layer of repair told a story, each patch a memory. The home became an autobiography of endurance, written in straw and soot. Despite its flaws, the leaks, the drafts, the damp, the peasant home had a soul. It was a place where laughter echoed against walls that had heard centuries of whispers, where smoke curled lazily toward the rafters, tracing stories into the dark, where the simplest act, mending a hole, sharing a bowl of soup, became sacred. At night, the firelight softened everything. The cracks in the wall looked like veins of gold. The smoke turned the air into mist. The walls, patched with moss and memory, glowed warm in the flicker. And suddenly, it didn't matter that the roof leaked, or that the floor was half mud. It was home, and that word home carried a warmth no storm could drown. Even the animals knew it. Cows lowed softly from the corner. Chickens clucked themselves to sleep. The occasional pig snored with surprising dignity. In the dim light, it was hard to tell where the people ended and the animals began. But perhaps that was the point. They were all part of the same fragile circle, breathing, surviving, warming one another against the cold indifference of the world. The wind, of course, was a permanent tenant. It slipped under doors, through gaps, between the very fibers of the walls. It moaned at night, a sound so constant that silence would have seemed strange without it. Sometimes it blew out the fire. Other times, it carried sparks to the thatch. A dangerous trick that kept peasants half awake, half praying. And yet, they spoke of the wind as though it were alive, mischievous, maybe, but not cruel. After all, it reminded them that they were still here, still warm, still human. When a particularly fierce gust rattled the shutters, someone would always mutter, "He's angry tonight," as though the wind were an old friend throwing a tantrum. It was easier to laugh than to fear, and laughter, again, made the air a little warmer. To live in such a home was to live in rhythm with imperfection. The walls might crumble, the roof might leak, the door might sag on its hinges, and yet life went on. There was a strange grace to it, a quiet poetry in the constant repair. Every flaw demanded attention, every crack a reminder of the delicate balance between safety and surrender. And in that endless cycle of mending and enduring, peasants became philosophers without knowing it. They learned that nothing lasts, and that's precisely why everything matters. A modern visitor might look at their homes and see poverty, but if you look closer, you'll see something deeper: ingenuity, community, and a fierce intimacy with the land itself. They didn't just live on the earth, they lived with it, in it, through it. Their walls were made of the same soil that grew their food, the same clay that stuck to their boots. And when they died, their bodies returned to it, completing a circle that had no beginning or end. When dawn breaks after a storm, and the frost melts into the cracks of the daub, the house glistens. The mud sparkles faintly in the sunlight. The straw gleams gold. For a moment, the humble cottage looks like it's wearing a crown. It's easy to forget that beauty doesn't need perfection. Sometimes it hides in the broken places in the crooked beam that never quite fit, in the patched wall that's seen 100 winters, in the way the light finds its way through a tiny hole in the roof. To the medieval peasant, that light was a promise. The sun was coming back. The frost would melt, the earth would soften again, and though the walls would need patching and the roof mending once more, they would do it with mud on their hands, laughter in their throats, and the quiet pride of those who had never stopped building. Because that's what it meant to be alive in those cold, wild centuries. To live not in comfort, but in persistence. To wake each day inside a house that was half miracle, half mud, and to love it anyway. Morning has come again, pale and brittle. The smoke from the hearth curls slowly toward the roof, seeking cracks through which to escape. The air inside is thick, yet strangely alive, filled with the faint rustle of straw, the soft snore of animals, and the quiet sighs of people who have, once again, survived the night. Step carefully. Beneath your feet, the ground feels hard as stone and colder than the breath of dawn. This, too, is part of the peasant's world, not the sky above, not the wind that whispers through the thatch, but the very ground beneath them, the earth they worked by day and slept upon by night. They called it floor, though it was really just the world, flattened and tamped into submission. A surface, not so much built as negotiated. It was a compacted dirt base, sometimes sprinkled with ashes or lined with planks, more often just the same soil their ancestors had plowed. The ground was both friend and enemy. It supported you, yes, but it also remembered the cold. It held on to it like a grudge. And every winter night, that cold rose up through the soles of your feet, through the straw, through the blankets, and into your bones, reminding you exactly where you came from. To live above the ground in winter was to live above a quiet danger. The earth itself turned to ice. Every footprint that had once been soft became sharp. The peasants knew this better than anyone. They learned to respect the ground, not fear it, but never forget its power. Sleep too close to the soil, an old saying went, and the soil will keep you. A grim piece of advice, but born of experience. Too many had drifted off to sleep on damp floors, only to wake shivering or not at all. And so, they invented a way of life that hovered just above the surface of death. Layers upon layers of straw, rushes, and hay. A soft barrier between body and earth. Not true comfort, but something like defiance. When they spread those rushes across the floor, it was an act of tenderness. Mothers and daughters worked together, laying down bundles of reeds with careful hands. The air filled with the dry, papery scent of riverbanks of summer remembered. It was almost beautiful, in its own humble way. Fresh rushes crackled like new parchment. The children would laugh as they walked barefoot across them, pretending it was a meadow in bloom. But within days, that illusion faded. The rushes began to darken, to flatten, to mix with the mud. The floor became what it always was, a living, breathing organism, soft in some places, suspiciously warm in others. The floor, if we can call it that, was never still. It grew, it changed, it decomposed. Bits of straw and hay mingled with spilled broth, ash, and fragments of daily life. The peasants didn't sweep much, not because they were lazy, but because sweeping stirred up the cold dust, and that dust was their insulation. Every few weeks, they laid down a new layer of rushes, Old ones were left beneath, pressed into the earth until they became part of the foundation, a compost of daily existence. Over the years, the floor rose slightly, an unintentional testament to survival. A geologist of the future could dig through those layers and read the history of the household like the rings of a tree. Here, the winter of bad harvest. Here, the year the goat had twins. Here, the spring flood that ruined everything and started again. And yes, it smelled. A blend of damp straw, smoke, animal musk, and the faint sweetness of decay. But to those who lived there, it was the smell of life continuing. The smell of the earth doing its quiet work beneath them, even as snow blanketed the world outside. Sometimes, when the night was silent, you could even hear it, the faint crackle of the floor settling, the soft squeak of a mouse tunneling through the straw, the whisper of the house breathing with you. Unpleasant? Perhaps, but there was a strange kind of companionship in it. The peasants lived so close to the land that even their floors reminded them of their place in its story. And then, above this shifting, breathing ground, were the beds. Beds, of course, is a generous word. Most were little more than wooden frames filled with hay or straw, covered by a thin sheet or old blanket. Some families slept directly on the floor, their straw arranged in careful piles, like nests built for warmth rather than beauty. The straw rustled beneath every movement. Turn over once, and it whispered. Turn twice, and it squealed. But peasants didn't mind. They were used to the sound of the world talking back to them. Still, the straw brought with it its own little universe. Insects, mites, the occasional frog that had stowed away from the barn. Fleas were the most devoted residents, tiny companions that neither famine nor frost could kill. At night, a family might settle into bed, sighing with relief, only to begin a slow dance of scratching and shifting. It wasn't glamorous, but it was routine. A child might complain, "Mama, they're biting again," and she'd murmur, half asleep, "Then they're keeping you warm." A dark sort of humor, yes, but it carried them through. Because truly, those beds, for all their discomfort, were lifelines. They lifted the body a few inches above the frozen earth, and in winter, a few inches could mean everything. A bit of distance between flesh and frost, a breath between life and the stillness that waited just below. It's easy to forget now how physical survival was in those centuries. There was no abstraction to it, no insulation between human and nature. The cold pressed against your skin, the damp crept into your bones, and your body learned to negotiate with it, to fight, to surrender, to adapt. To sleep in a straw bed was to engage in a nightly bargain. I will rest here, in this rustling nest, if you, earth, will let me wake again. The fight against cold didn't end once you were under the covers. It continued, in silence and in stillness. Peasants knew the rules instinctively. Never sleep alone if you can help it. Share warmth like a secret. Sleep close, breathe slow, cover every inch. They became experts in layering. A blanket might be made from old wool cloaks, sewn together with whatever thread could be found. Sometimes they laid animal hides over the straw, hair side down, to trap heat. Other nights, they simply piled on everything, cloaks, tunics, rags, until the weight of it pressed them into the bed like fossils. The result was a strange blend of suffocation and safety. You might wake in the night, sweating under the layers, only to peel one off and immediately regret it as the cold swooped in like a vengeful spirit. The body adapted in strange ways. Hands curled into fists while sleeping, toes tucked instinctively between knees. The peasants became their own blankets, compact and efficient, and when morning came, rising from bed felt like breaking through the crust of ice on a pond, abrupt, painful, necessary. You might think of cold as something to escape, but for them, it was a presence always there, like an invisible roommate who never paid rent but kept you humble. The cold shaped their habits, their humor, even their sense of time. They measured nights not by hours, but by the number of times they had to stir the fire, or by how often someone shouted, half asleep, "The draft's back!" Children learned early how to bank the embers, to cover them gently with ash, so they'd still glow by morning. It was a small science passed from one generation to the next, a ritual older than memory. And through it all, the ground remained beneath them silent, waiting, patient. It was the foundation of everything, their homes, their lives, their rest. And yet, it was also their greatest reminder of fragility. Even in their coldest hours, peasants found ways to laugh. One old tale tells of a man who complained that his floor was too wet to sleep on. His wife, practical and unimpressed, said, "Then turn over and let the other side dry." Another story speaks of a family who laid so much straw on their floor that their pig refused to leave, declaring it warmer than the barn. Humor softened the edges of discomfort. It turned suffering into story. Because when you live in a world where frost sneaks in under the door and the earth itself tries to reclaim your house, laughter is a rebellion, small, ridiculous, but vital. And laughter, like warmth, spread easily. A joke whispered in the dark could thaw a room faster than fire. There was beauty, too, in those humble floors, beauty hidden beneath the grime and the straw and the smell. The way the rushes gleamed in the firelight, golden and soft. The way the earth seemed to hum underfoot, as if whispering, "I remember you." The peasants didn't decorate much, but their homes were never empty of meaning. Every handful of straw laid down was an offering, a thank you to the land that gave them both hardship and shelter. They understood something we often forget, that comfort is not the absence of struggle, but the quiet persistence of life in spite of it. Their world was stitched together from imperfection. Their homes were patchworks, their floors alive, their beds full of creatures that refused to die. And yet, each night they found a way to sleep, to dream of spring, to laugh in their half-sleep, to wake again. That is endurance in its purest form. When morning comes and the first light seeps through the cracks, the peasants rise. Their joints ache, their feet touch the cold earth, but they smile anyway. The ground is still frozen, the air still biting, but they have survived. Again, the floor creaks softly beneath them as they stir the embers back to life. A child giggles as she tosses new rushes onto the ground, pretending she's spreading sunshine. The mother hums, the father yawns, the goat snorts from its corner of the room. Life resumes, and beneath it all, the earth waits patiently, as it always has. It listens to their footsteps, their laughter, their whispered prayers. It bears their weight and keeps their secrets. It is cold, yes, but it is constant. And perhaps, in some quiet way, the peasants loved it for that, because in their world, there was no escaping the earth, only learning to live gently upon it, to build, to patch, to warm, to sleep, all on the same ground that had watched them be born. They were, in every sense, of the soil. And though the ground beneath them was frozen, their hearts, through laughter, love, and sheer stubbornness, stayed warm. The earth is cold beneath them. The walls murmur in their sleep, and the roof sighs with every gust of wind, but in the center of the peasant home, a single glow remains. It flickers, it breathes. It is small enough to cup in two hands, yet powerful enough to keep death waiting at the door. This is the hearth, the true heart of the home. It was not merely a place for cooking or for warmth. It was life itself, the center of gravity for every breath, every conversation, every dream whispered into the night. Without it, the home was just mud and straw. With it, it became a sanctuary. Imagine the scene at dusk. The last smear of daylight has vanished, and the world outside dissolves into shadow. There are no candles, yet they are precious and saved for holy days. The hearth glows faintly in the gloom, its light soft and golden. licking the edges of the room like the memory of a sunrise. It's mesmerizing. Even now, the way flame moves, the way it dances between birth and death. For the medieval peasant, it wasn't poetic, it was practical. Yet somehow, it was also holy. The fire was the first thing kindled in a new home, and the last thing extinguished when a family moved or died. Some families even believed the fire had a spirit of its own, a quiet, watchful guardian that must be respected, never insulted, never left alone too long. Each night, before sleeping, someone would whisper a small blessing into the embers. "Stay alive till morning," they'd murmur. "Keep the frost away." It was half prayer, half plea. And perhaps, in a world where warmth meant survival, every hearth truly was a little altar. Of course, the hearth's gift came with a price: smoke. Thick, persistent, inescapable smoke. Most peasant homes had no chimney. The fire pit sat directly in the center of the floor, its smoke meant to escape through a hole in the thatch or a gap under the eaves. But smoke, like the cold, had its own opinions. It liked to linger, curling around beams, slipping into hair and fabric, painting everything in shades of gray. The walls darkened over the years, until they looked almost carved from soot. The ceiling turned black. Every spoon, every bowl, every strand of hair carried the scent of burnt wood, the medieval version of ode to survival. Visitors from the outside world, those delicate souls from towns or manors, would often cough and wave their hands, saying, "How can you breathe in here?" The peasants, used to it since birth, would smile through the haze. "Easy," they'd say, "if you don't stop." They were half right. You didn't breathe through the smoke, you breathed with it, learning its moods. Sometimes it hung low, a fog that made eyes sting and tears fall for no reason. Sometimes it rose clean and straight, a good omen, a sign the fire was happy. And when it refused to rise at all, when the air grew too thick, that was when trouble brewed. Doors were flung open, straw fans waved wildly, curses muttered at both fire and wind until balance returned. It was a smoky marriage, but a loyal one. The peasants accepted the smoke as they accepted the cold, not with joy, but with humor. One woman, they say, joked that smoke kept her young because it preserved her like a ham. Another said it gave her the complexion of a saintly statue, gray and glowing from within. And truthfully, the smoke did serve its purpose. It drove away pests, kept the thatch dry, and even helped preserve food hanging from the rafters. So they let it fill their lungs, their hair, their dreams, a cloud that marked them like a badge of survival. The hearth was not just warmth. It was the center of everything. Here they cooked, prayed, argued, laughed, sang, and stitched. It was their television, their fireplace, their dining table, and their storyteller. A black iron pot, always hanging or resting above the coals, was rarely empty. Into it went whatever could be found: cabbage leaves, barley, a bone from last week's stew, a pinch of salt if fortune allowed. The resulting mixture was called pottage, the culinary heart of medieval peasant life. It was never the same twice, and it was never quite enough, but it was hot, and that mattered more than flavor. They cooked slowly, patiently, stirring with long wooden spoons while gossiping about the neighbor's cow or reciting old rhymes. Children crouched beside the fire, watching the pot bubble, their mouths watering at the smell of something that might, if you squinted, be considered soup. When meals were ready, they ate right there on the hearth's edge, dipping coarse bread into the broth, letting the steam warm their faces. There were no fine manners, no courses, just shared bowls, shared spoons, and shared silence, broken occasionally by the crunch of a burnt crust or the soft sigh of contentment. After supper, the hearth changed roles. It became the family theater. Stories rose with the smoke tales of saints and spirits, of talking wolves and clever maidens. The firelight danced across their faces, turning each listener into both audience and character. The hearth was also a church in miniature. There, beneath the roof of smoke, they whispered prayers for good harvests, safe births, and kind winters. A small iron cross might hang above the fire, blackened by soot, reminding them that divine light and earthly flame were cousins. And though their prayers were humble, they burned as steadily as the embers below. Keeping the fire alive was a communal art, a duty that rotated quietly from one pair of hands to another. During the day, the men tended it while cooking or mending tools. At night, the women or oldest children took turns to watch it sleep. The art of banking, covering the embers with ash to keep them glowing till morning, was passed down like sacred knowledge. Too much ash, and the flame would die. Too little, and it would flare and burn through the floor. A perfect bank meant waking to warmth and pride. The fire had survived another night, and so had they. No one took that lightly. A cold hearth meant more than discomfort. It meant danger. To relight a dead fire, one needed dry kindling, flint, or in desperate times the goodwill of a neighbor. And though medieval communities were close, no one liked admitting, "Our fire went out." It felt shameful, like confessing a lapse of faith. So families guarded their flames like treasure. Children were taught early to respect it, to never play too close, to feed it small twigs and whispers, to bow slightly when the sparks leapt too high. Some families gave their fire a name. Old Red, one might say, is in a good mood tonight. And if it crackled loudly, they took it as laughter. In that way, the hearth became more than an object. It was a member of the household, temperamental, hungry, but dependable. It had moods. It sulked when neglected, roared when overfed, purred when just right. And everyone knew how to tend it. The mother's patient hand, the father's steady breath, the child's delighted gasp at every spark that rose like a tiny star. Outside, the nights were long and merciless. Wolves howled beyond the fields, wind tore at the thatch, and the moon watched silently as frost grew on every blade of grass. But inside, the hearth glowed. Its light painted everything in amber. The rough beams, the pots, the sleeping faces of children curled together under woolen cloaks. It softened the edges of hardship, turned mud walls into gold, and made even the humblest room feel eternal. There is something profoundly human about that scene, a small group gathered around firelight, sharing warmth and story while the world beyond the walls freezes. It is one of our oldest rituals. The peasants didn't know it, but in those moments, they were keeping alive not just their fire, but the very idea of civilization, of connection, of shared flame against shared dark. And when someone coughed or laughed or stirred the pot, the sparks leapt upward, as if applauding. Every breath mingled with the smoke. Every exhale joined the slow, swirling rhythm of air above the hearth. The peasants lived literally inside their fire's lungs, a strange intimacy few of us would tolerate today, but one that bound them to the rhythm of the flame. You could tell a lot about a person from how they treated the fire. The careful ones blew softly, coaxing new life from embers with patience. The reckless ones tossed in too much wood, filling the room with sparks. And the wise ones, the grandmothers and old farmers, didn't fuss at all. They simply watched, waiting for the moment when the fire itself decided to breathe again. Fire taught them humility. It reminded them that warmth could not be commanded, only nurtured. It was a living metaphor, stubborn, luminous, fragile. Perhaps that's why they loved it so much. Despite the burns and the smoke, it mirrored their own lives, small, uncertain, yet defiantly bright. As the night deepened and the stories ended, the hearth grew quieter. Its light dimmed to a deep red, the color of memory. The last pot was emptied, the last spoon laid aside. Someone would kneel and gently cover the embers with ash, murmuring that same old phrase, "Sleep now and wake." In the silence that followed, The house breathed out smoke, drifting upward like a sigh. The family lay down, the animals settled, the world turned slow again. And in that stillness, the fire continued its secret work, burning just enough to keep the air alive, glowing just enough to promise morning. If you could stand outside, then, in the frozen dark, your feet crunching on frost and look through the cracks of the wall, you'd see it. A soft, golden pulse, steady and quiet, the only star burning on earth. That was the hearth, humble, smoky, imperfect, yet the purest symbol of hope the medieval world ever knew. Because in that little circle of light, amid all the mud and frost and weary laughter, the peasants achieved something miraculous. They turned suffering into warmth, darkness into gathering, existence into meaning. They made the cold night beautiful. Night again. The stars are sharp and cold, pricking holes in the velvet dark. The fields sleep under their quilt of frost, and the wind prowls outside, patient as a wolf. Inside the little cottage, the fire has burned low. Its light is no longer a flame, but a breath, faint, red, trembling. And there, beside it, kneels a figure, moving with slow precision. She is banking the fire. It is not just a chore. It is a ritual, a quiet, careful act of faith, the ancient art of keeping warmth alive when everything else in the world is asleep. Fire banking, in the medieval home, was a science passed down not through books but through hands. The principle was simple. To keep the embers glowing overnight, you smothered them gently, not to kill, but to protect. Ash, paradoxically, was both the enemy and the savior of fire. Too much, and it suffocated the coals. Too little, and the wind or cold would steal their last spark before dawn. So, the peasant woman for it was often the woman's task. Though the oldest son or husband might do it when she was weary, would kneel by the hearth, draw the glowing embers into a small circle, and whisper to them. She would rake a few handfuls of clean, soft ash from the edges of the pit and sprinkle it over the embers like snow. A hush fell over the room. The children pretended to sleep, but their eyes half opened, watching her silhouette bend and rise in the firelight. Each movement had its own rhythm, the slow sweep of the rake, the gentle pat of the ash, the sigh of her breath. Then she would sit back, listening. If she could still hear the faint tick of heat, that tiny pulsing crackle, she would nod. It would last till morning. If not, she would uncover it again, coaxing it back to life with a twist of straw, a spark of flint, and a prayer muttered under her breath. It was as delicate as tending a heartbeat. Too much haste, and the ember died. Too much fear, and you'd wake the whole house with smoke. And so they learned patience. The kind of patience that only comes from knowing that warmth is not owed to you, but earned. In some villages, families named their fires Old Faithful, one might say, or Mother Warmth. The idea wasn't superstition so much as affection, a recognition that this glow in the center of the house had shared every hunger, every laugh, every loss. The fire had seen everything. The births, the feasts, the arguments, the funerals. It was the only witness that never forgot. So when someone banked the embers at night, they weren't merely saving heat, they were tucking in a companion. The fire slept under its blanket of ash, like an old friend wrapped in dust. And in the morning, when the first stirrings of life began again, the creak of wood, the grunt of the pig, the baby's soft whimper, someone would kneel and uncover the coals. With a few breaths, a few twigs, the red glow would bloom again into gold. That moment when the fire came back to life was as close to magic as any peasant ever saw. But sometimes, of course, it went wrong. Sometimes the ash smothered too well. Sometimes the wind changed and stole the air away. And sometimes the fire simply gave up. There were few sights more disheartening than a dead hearth at dawn. The air would be damp, the walls sweating, the floor colder than a grave. The pot on the hook hung empty, useless. The family's breath misted in the half-light. There was no flint left. The kindling was wet. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away, and his fire might be dead too. And so the day began with pleading not to God, but to cinders. They would kneel and stir the ashes, desperate to find a spark. Sometimes, if fortune was merciful, a faint red shimmer appeared, and everyone breathed on it in turn, father, mother, child, their breath mingling in one small hope. If it caught, they cheered softly, like pilgrims who'd seen a miracle. But if it didn't, they'd send someone running across the fields with a covered pot to beg a coal from another house. This was called borrowing fire, and it was both charity and ceremony. No one refused it. To deny a neighbor warmth was to curse your own hearth. So even the poorest homes kept a spare ember, wrapped in ash, ready to give. In this way, the entire village was connected by invisible threads of smoke. Every home's fire was part of one great living organism. When one spark died, another would share its life. On especially cold nights, no one slept deeply. The fire was too important to trust entirely to ash and prayer. Someone always stayed half awake, an old woman with aching bones, or a boy too restless to dream. They would rise now and then, poke at the coals, add a stick of wood, mumble a complaint, and lie back down again. It was a kind of companionship, man and flame keeping each other alive. Outside, the snow howled, but inside, two small things, a human and a hearth, glowed defiantly. Of course, there were mishaps. A clumsy hand might drop too much wood and smother the fire. A goat, wandering too close, might knock the pot and send sparks flying. And there were darker accidents too. A log that rolled, a thatch that caught, a night that ended in smoke and ash, for reasons no one spoke of afterward. Fire was life, but life was never without risk. Still, they risked it gladly. For what was the alternative? To wake to cold stone and silence, to frost that crept into the bones and whispered, "Sleep forever?" Better to live with danger and warmth than to die in safety and ice. Each household had its own method, its own tiny traditions. Some swore by birch ash, fine and white, the best blanket for embers. Others used peat dust or crushed reeds, claiming it held heat longer. A few had inherited old clay lids or half-broken pots, which they placed upside down over the coals to hold them snug till dawn. Mothers taught daughters, fathers taught sons, and so the ritual passed quietly through the generations. No one wrote it down. There was no need. The body remembered. The hands knew by instinct the feel of living heat under ash, the delicate balance between warmth and suffocation. You could tell an experienced fire banker by the way their fingers moved, cautious but confident, as though petting a wild animal that loved them only on certain days. And every family had stories, moments when the fire nearly died but didn't. "That was the winter Old Faithful kept us alive," they'd say, pointing to a blackened hearthstone. Or, "Remember the night the frost came through the walls and we thought we'd lose it? Your grandfather blew on those coals for an hour straight till they woke." They spoke of these moments the way others spoke of battles or miracles, because for them, they were both. When dawn came pale, blue, hesitant, it was time to wake the fire again. The ash would be cool on the surface, but underneath, if you dug carefully, you'd find warmth, the faintest orange pulse. They'd blow gently, once, twice, then a spark, a flicker, a small sigh of flame curling up, stretching like a sleepy child. There it was, morning. The room filled slowly with light and motion, the scraping of spoons, the bleating of goats, the rustle of straw underfoot. Someone would smile and say, "She's woken," as if the fire were a beloved grandmother, slow but dependable. And in that moment, it wasn't just warmth, they felt it was triumph. Another night conquered, another day begun. In every sense, the fire was their life. It was the beating heart of the family, the center of their small universe. To tend it was to tend their own humanity. It burned in defiance of everything that sought to extinguish them. The cold, the dark, the hunger, the endless uncertainty of their world. Each ember was a tiny sun, each spark a reminder of creation itself. It was no wonder, then, that fire found its way into their prayers, their stories, their metaphors for love and faith. When a child was born, they lit a fresh flame. When someone died, they let the fire burn low, out of respect. When two families quarreled, they spoke of cold hearths. And when peace was made, they shared bread before the fire once more. Fire was both literal and symbolic, a mirror of the fragile, radiant thread that kept them human. If you stepped into one of those huts in the middle of the night, smoke hanging low, air thick with the smell of wool and ash, you might think it bleak. But stay a while. Listen, hear the steady crackle of buried embers, like a heartbeat under the floor. Hear the soft breathing of sleepers, the rustle of straw, the occasional cough that proves someone is still alive. See how the faint red glow touches the walls, the faces, the old pots? That's not poverty. That's endurance made visible. These people, who had so little, were keeping alive something greater than themselves. They were caretakers of continuity, guardians of the fragile line between night and day, death and life, silence and song. Their fire wasn't grand or beautiful by noble standards, but it was faithful. It burned because they believed it must. And perhaps that's the truest magic of all, the quiet miracle of persistence. Not the roaring blaze, but the hidden ember. Not the sunrise, but the soft red glow that makes the sunrise possible. By the time the world outside stirs again, frost melting, birds calling, the smell of thawing earth drifting through the cracks, the fire has already been awake for hours. It greets the day with a sigh and a stretch, feeding on the first sticks of kindling. Its smoke rises, slow and graceful, slipping through the roof to join the sky. And as it does, it carries the night with it, the whispered prayers, the dreams, the fears, the laughter, all turned into invisible warmth. The villagers step outside, squinting against the new light, their faces ruddy with smoke and sleep. They have survived. Again, and in the heart of every home behind them, a quiet red core still burns, the secret that keeps the world turning. The fire has been banked, the last pot scraped clean, and the door barred against the wind. The cottage grows quiet. The embers glow faintly beneath their ash blanket, pulsing like a tired heart. Outside, the snow falls soundlessly, the whole world tucked beneath its own cold quilt. Inside, though, another kind of warmth begins to gather, one made not of flame, but of flesh and breath. It is time to sleep, and sleep, in the medieval winter, was a group affair. First come the children, half drowsy already, tumbling toward the straw mattresses with sleepy grins. Then the elders, slower, muttering prayers as they lower themselves carefully onto the hay. The mother checks the fire one last time. The father seals the door with a wooden bar, testing it with his hand. The animals shift in their corners, hooves and paws shuffling softly. And then, the nightly migration begins, that slow, practiced arrangement of bodies into what might be called order. If you stood above the room and could bear the smell, you'd see something remarkable. A choreography older than memory, learned through necessity and love. People and beasts curling together, forming a single living organism designed to cheat the cold. They did not think of it as romantic or strange. It was survival, and also, in its own quiet way, communion. Let's be honest, there's no elegant way to describe it. At best, it resembled a human lasagna, layers upon layers of warmth and weariness, pressed together by the sheer force of winter's cruelty. Children in the middle, small and soft and shielded, Parents on the outside, like crusts, taking the brunt of the cold. Sometimes grandparents, too, tucked just behind the little ones, their thin bodies preserved by the heat of youth. And if there was space, a dog or two squeezed in, belly to back, tail curled neatly against someone's knees. Even the cat, that proud little monarch of mice, would eventually concede defeat to the frost and slide silently beneath the blankets. It would emerge in the morning covered in straw and regret, glaring at everyone as if the whole arrangement had been beneath its dignity. The air was thick with warmth, yes, but also with sound. Soft snores, rustling straw, the occasional whisper, someone turning, someone sighing, someone's elbow finding someone else's ribs. A symphony of closeness, conducted by exhaustion. They didn't call it affection, they called it Tuesday night. The peasants had a science of warmth long before thermodynamics was ever written down. They knew instinctively that the strong went on the edges, the men, the broad-backed sons, the stubborn ones who could bear the drafts from the cracks in the wall. The frail and the small slept inside, nestled in the center like the core of a star. Sometimes even livestock joined the formation. A goat near the foot of the bed, a piglet tucked against a child's side. In some parts of Europe, cows were kept in the same structure as the family, separated by a low wooden barrier, but close enough that their body heat seeped through the air. Better a warm cow than a cold saint, an old saying went. And truly, on certain nights, even holiness couldn't compete with the comfort of a steaming bovine nearby. Blankets were few, so layering became an art form. First straw, then cloth, then hides, then old cloaks. Over that, another layer of humanity. Then another. In the middle of this, the fire's dying warmth still reached faintly, just enough to turn the breath fog above their heads into a silver mist. If you'd entered that room in silence, you might have mistaken it for a single creature, vast, gentle, breathing deeply, the hive of winter sleep. But warmth was not just measured in degrees. There was another kind, invisible but powerful, that came from voices, from laughter, from the shared rhythm of storytelling. Long before sleep claimed them, families talked, not of grand events, but of small ones, the stubborn chicken that refused the coop, the way the frost made the trees crack like bones, the dream someone had last night of bread that never ended. These stories were as vital as firewood. They kept the darkness from growing too heavy. And in telling them, the family wove another blanket, one of words, soft and familiar, laid gently over their shared fatigue. A mother might hum, her voice low and smoky from years of breathing ash. A child might ask for the tale of the winter fox again, the one who tricked the moon. And though everyone knew the story by heart, they listened as if it were new, because in hearing it again, they remembered who they were, the ones who had endured, who had made it through, who had found warmth where there should have been none. The fire might fade, but the stories kept burning. In such intimacy, privacy was a myth. You knew every rhythm of every person beside you, the way your brother mumbled in his sleep, the way your grandmother's breath caught before each snore, the way your father always muttered good night not once, but twice, as if to be sure the dark heard him. Sometimes this closeness bred irritation, an elbow too sharp, a knee too restless, a snore that could wake the saints. But even irritation was proof of life, and life in winter was no small thing. When the wind roared outside, rattling the shutters and sighing through the thatch, the huddled family became an island of warmth. They could feel one another's hearts, the shared pulse beneath layers of wool and skin. It wasn't comfort, exactly. It was something older, instinctual, sacred. If the world was ending, and many winters made it feel so, at least they would end together. In harsher months, when the cold grew unbearable, the walls between families blurred as well. A neighbor might knock at dusk, shivering, asking to share the fire for a night. No one refused. There was always space, or rather, space could always be made. They'd shift, rearrange, squeezed tighter. A stranger became a pillow. A neighbor's child found a spot between your own. By morning, everyone smelled alike of smoke, straw, and stubbornness. Sometimes, when travelers passed through, they too were welcomed in, if only for a night. The hearth expanded to include them. The warmth spread. There was something profoundly democratic about a winter's night. All distinctions melted down to the simple truth of breath and survival. And if, in the morning, one woke with a stranger's arm across one's chest, or a sheep's hoof pressed gently against one's shin, well, so be it. Warmth was warmth, however it came. It said that in such sleeping arrangements, dreams mingled, that the breath of one sleeper carried fragments of another's story. Maybe that's only poetry, but on certain nights, when the air grew thick and everyone breathed in the same rhythm, it didn't seem impossible. Dreams were talked about at breakfast. The child who dreamt of endless milk, the father who dreamt of the old oak in summer, the grandmother who claimed to have seen St. Bridget walking through the snow, her hands full of fire. Dreams became omens, conversation, comfort. In a life of repetition, they were the only surprises winter allowed. And perhaps, in that closeness, in that nightly tangle of limbs and hearts, some part of the human spirit learned what it meant to belong. Not in comfort, but in proximity. Not in peace, but in persistence. It's easy to romanticize it now, to picture the scene as quaint or noble. But the truth was simpler and deeper. They didn't huddle for beauty. They huddled to stay alive. And yet, out of that necessity grew a kind of quiet holiness. They understood something modern hearts sometimes forget, that warmth shared is more powerful than warmth hoarded. That bodies, like fires, burn brighter together. That love in its truest form is not a grand gesture, but the decision to stay close through the long night. In the dark, pressed shoulder to shoulder, they learned faith not in gods, though they prayed to those too, but in one another, in the heartbeat beside them, steady and real, in the warmth that proved life had not yet gone out of the world. And when the first faint light of morning crept through the cracks in the wall, they woke together, tangled, rumpled, still alive. They stretched, laughed softly, groaned at the stiffness in their limbs. Someone poked at the fire. Someone else opened the door. Cold air rushed in, cruel but fresh, and the circle broke only to be remade that night, and the next, and the next. It wasn't only survival. Something else grew out of those long, shared nights, something invisible but enduring, a kind of communal spirit, a memory written into the bones. Those who slept together in the cold shared more than warmth. They shared stories, breath, laughter, loss. And when the winters passed, when spring finally softened the earth and daylight lingered again, that bond remained. They'd greet each other in the fields with the easy intimacy of those who had survived the same darkness. They'd remember the nights when the fire was low and the wind screamed, and they'd say almost proudly, "We made it through." For them, that was all the glory they needed. If you could stand at the doorway of such a home just before dawn, you would see it, the faint shimmer of heat rising from the huddled shapes, the red glow of the hearth breathing beneath its ash. The room would smell of life, animal, human, humble, a tapestry of existence woven tight against the cold. And in that soft tangle of bodies and dreams, you would find not misery, but meaning. For in their closeness, the peasants discovered a truth far greater than comfort. That survival was never a solitary act. That warmth, whether of fire or flesh, was something made together. They may have been poor, cold, and weary, but each night they built a small, living miracle, a circle of breath and hope, a human sun glowing quietly beneath the winter sky. And if heaven ever looked down on such a scene, it surely smiled. Because there, in a world of frost and hunger, the simplest creatures had found the oldest form of grace, to share warmth, to endure together, to live side by side until morning. By now, the night has thickened. The fire hums softly under its blanket of ash. The family drifts toward sleep, and in the dimness, another kind of warmth stirs, one that snorts, shifts, and occasionally lets out a sound far less poetic than a sigh. Because where the medieval peasants slept, the animals slept too. Not outside in the frozen dark, but inside in the same room, under the same roof, breathing the same smoky air. It wasn't madness, it was mathematics. A cow gave off more heat than any log, a pig could warm an entire corner, and a goat, bless its stubborn soul, radiated like a small living furnace. And so, as the snow pressed against the walls and the frost crept under the door, the peasants welcomed their beasts into the house not as guests, but as partners in survival. They were, quite literally, living heaters. The ritual began every winter, when the first hard frost settled over the fields and the water troughs froze solid overnight. That was the signal. It was time to bring the barn inside. At first, it might start with a single chicken, a sly, clever creature that found its way through a crack in the door and decided never to leave. Then came the goat, stamping and complaining, dragging a bit of straw on its hooves. The pig followed soon after, grunting as if it owned the place. And finally, with some effort and much muttering, the family led the cow indoors. She ducked her great head through the doorway, her warm breath fogging the air, her hooves thudding softly on the packed earth floor. The entire room shifted around her presence, suddenly fuller, warmer, alive. It wasn't elegance, but it was effective. Within an hour, the room's temperature rose by several degrees. The difference between life and frostbite could be measured in the heartbeat of a cow. Of course, this sudden mingling of species brought complications. There was noise, there was smell, there was the occasional unfortunate accident involving hooves, toes, and chamber pots. But the peasants took it in stride. They knew that warmth, like grace, often came wrapped in less than pleasant packages. To modern ears, the scene would be chaos, a barnyard symphony in D minor, chickens murmuring in their sleep, feathers rustling like paper, goats muttering to themselves, always on the verge of mischief, the pig grumbling with deep philosophical displeasure, and somewhere in the background, the steady, rhythmic chewing of the cow, patient and unbothered, as if reminding everyone that existence, despite everything, goes on. Add to that the soft snoring of humans, the crackle of the fire, and the occasional drip from the roof, and you had the soundtrack of medieval survival, raw, ridiculous, yet oddly comforting. It was noisy, yes. It was smelly, absolutely. But it was also warm, and in the hierarchy of winter priorities, warmth beat dignity every time. The smell was the price of life. There was no escaping it, a thick, earthy blend of hay, dung, smoke, and sweat. The scent of beasts and people living too close for comfort, layered over months of never truly being clean. Yet after a few days, the nose surrendered. The mind adjusted, and soon enough, the smell became invisible, not a nuisance, but a background hum of existence. In a strange way, it even comforted them. It meant the animals were there, breathing, alive, radiating their precious heat. The smell was proof of life, of warmth, of survival. A clean house, after all, was a cold house. If a traveler happened to pass through and wrinkle their nose, the peasants would only laugh. Smells like home, they'd say, smiling proud. And they were right, because in a world where cold could kill, smell was a small price to pay for breath and heartbeat. Space was always tight in a peasant's home. There might be a single main room, one hearth, one bed, one table, one floor, and far too many souls. So the arrival of the animals meant rearranging life itself. The cow usually had the place of honor, near the back wall where the draft was weakest. The goat, restless and curious, was kept closer to the door both to guard it and to prevent her from chewing on the bedding. The pig stayed near the family, as its body heat was legendary, though its manners were not. Chickens perched anywhere they pleased, beams, baskets, even the headboard if they could manage it. It was not equality, it was a social hierarchy of warmth. The more heat you produced, the higher your rank. The cow was queen, the goat a mischievous noble, the pig a grumpy but necessary baron, and the chickens, well, they were the peasants of the animal world, endlessly underfoot and impossible to manage. And through it all, the humans were somewhere in the middle, masters in name only, servants in practice. They mucked, fed, and soothed their barn companions as one would tend to temperamental relatives. Because for these few brutal months, everyone in that hut feathered, furred, or freckled was family. A clever farmer knew exactly how much warmth each animal could offer. A full-grown cow could raise the temperature of a small cottage by several degrees. A pig was nearly as efficient, its fat acting like a built-in furnace. Goats, smaller but energetic, radiated warmth unevenly, excellent on good days, bitey on bad ones. Chickens were minimal heaters, but their bodies gave off a kind of persistent coziness, like small hand warmers with feathers and opinions. It wasn't uncommon to measure nights by the animal's comfort. If the cow lay down early, it meant the cold was biting. If the goats huddled together, frost was near. If even the chickens stopped pecking, it was time to gather everyone closer to the fire. Their behavior was the barometer of winter, their warmth a kind of insurance. When the wind howled, the people pressed a little nearer to the beasts, feeling their body heat soak through the darkness like the pulse of the earth itself. There's something deeply human and humbling about those nights. To share space so closely with creatures, to depend on them not as possessions but as partners, was to erase the fragile line between human and nature. The peasants didn't see it as strange. They were not separate from the land or its creatures. They were of the same substance. The cow's breath was their breath. The pig's warmth was their warmth. They understood instinctively what modern people forget, that life is not divided by comfort but bound by necessity. And that sometimes the most honest kind of companionship comes not from words, but from silence and shared warmth in the dark. It wasn't noble, it wasn't romantic, it was simply true. Of course, not every night was peaceful. There were moments of slapstick chaos that would have made the saints laugh. A goat might step on someone's hand in the dark. A cow's tail might swat a sleeping face. The pig might, in a moment of midnight inspiration, decide to rearrange the straw. And when it happened, as it often did, there was muttering, laughter, and the occasional creative curse. But by morning, no one was angry, because despite the noise and the smell and the indignities, everyone had survived the night, and that was reason enough to forgive. Even the children grew up with fondness for those memories. Years later, they would recall the warmth of the animals, the safety of their heavy presence, the way the cow's breath fogged the morning air like a blessing. And they'd laugh at how they used to share their bed with a pig and think nothing of it. Because back then, it wasn't strange. It was simply winter. By the height of January, every home in the village had become a patchwork of man and beast. Smoke rose from the thatch, steam from the animal's breath, both blending into the same pale mist that hung over the frozen world. Inside, the air was thick but alive. The walls sweated, the windows wept, the fire sighed, and through it all, life pulsed the warm chorus of heartbeats and breath that defied the silence outside. The animals didn't know they were saviors. They only knew that inside, it was not as cold. And the humans didn't pretend it was pleasant, only necessary. In that necessity, though, there was a kind of grace, a strange harmony born of discomfort, an alliance forged not from choice but from shared struggle. They didn't call it beauty, but it was beautiful the way life found ways to survive, to adapt, to keep glowing even when everything froze. When dawn came, it did not come gently. The rooster, having slept in luxury all night, announced his triumph to the world with unholy enthusiasm. The cow rose first, stretching her neck, her breath steaming like incense. The goat began plotting its first escape before the fire was even lit. The pig grunted, unimpressed by both dawn and destiny, and the humans, groaning, laughed. Another night conquered, another morning earned. The room reeked of life, heavy and warm and glorious. And as they opened the door to the frozen world beyond, the air rushed in cold, clean, sharp meeting the thick animal heat that billowed out. For a moment, the two worlds mingled, frost and breath, death and life, silence and sound. Then someone shut the door again quickly. Too cold. If you strip away the romanticism, what remains is something more profound: coexistence. Those peasants, huddled in their smoky huts with their animals, lived in a state of constant reminder that warmth is a shared miracle, that survival is never solitary, and that life, in all its noise and stink, is still infinitely precious. Their homes were not clean, their air not sweet, but their hearts were steady. They lived surrounded by fur and feather and faith, and in that messy closeness they found something holy. Because when the wind howled and the frost clawed at the door, what mattered most wasn't silence or space or dignity. It was life breathing, huffing, snorting, scratching, sacred life crowded together in defiance of the dark. And in that crowded room, under the low beam and the sighing roof, there was warmth enough to see them through till spring. The morning comes reluctantly pale, tired, unsure if it's really wanted. The first light slips through cracks in the wall, touches the steam rising from the animals, and glimmers faintly on the faces of the newly awakened. The air smells of smoke and straw, of damp wool and stubborn life. Someone coughs, someone yawns, someone prods the embers back to life. The day begins not with ceremony, but with a collective groan, the sound of people preparing to put their armor back on. Not armor of iron, mind you, but of wool and grime. The fashion of survival. Because in the medieval winter, every morning was a dress rehearsal for endurance. Getting dressed in winter was less about vanity and more about strategy, a kind of textile engineering performed with whatever scraps life had to offer. The first layer was usually linen, though calling it clean would be a bold choice of word. It was often rough, hand-woven, patched in too many places to count. But linen had a virtue. It wicked moisture away from the skin, or at least pretended to. Over that came wool thick, heavy, and scratchy enough to wake the dead. Peasants wore it because they must, not because they liked it. Each garment was spun from sheep they'd probably met personally, dyed in colors ranging from mud brown to grayish mud brown. Then came the cloak, the all-important outer layer, the line between warmth and death. A good cloak could last decades, patched and repatched, until it became less a garment and more a record of winters survived. And, above all else, layers. The rule was simple: the more the merrier. If it could be worn, it was worn. Shirts over tunics, tunics over dresses, dresses under cloaks, cloaks beneath furs, all tied together with belts and hope. Fashion, in that time, was not a statement. It was a barricade. Wool was the peasant's constant companion. It itched, it scratched, it absorbed everything: smoke, sweat, rain, the faint memory of the sheep it came from. But it worked. It trapped air, held warmth, and didn't freeze when damp. And in a world where laundry was an act of bravery, wool's reluctance to die made it precious. When it got wet, and it always did, it smelled like the ghost of a barn. But by the second hour, you stopped noticing. After all, everything smelled like the ghost of a barn. Sometimes they lined their cloaks with scraps of sheepskin or even fur from small animals, rabbits, squirrels, the occasional unlucky cat. The results were uneven. A noble might wear ermine, a peasant wore whatever ran slow enough to catch, and yet there was pride in it, the sense that each patch of fur, each coarse thread, was a tiny rebellion against the cold. In the medieval village, clothing wasn't just worn, it was lived in. Every garment had a story, and most of them involved smoke, mud, and mild regret. If a tunic ripped, it was patched. If it stained, it stayed that way. If it began to fall apart entirely, it became something new, a scarf, a rag, a baby's wrap, or, in moments of true desperation, a wick for the fire. The beauty of this wardrobe philosophy was its honesty. There was no pretending to be spotless. Cleanliness was seasonal, reserved for the thaw, for spring, when water no longer froze before it reached the bucket. In winter, the rule was simple. If it doesn't kill you, wear it. And then, of course, there was dirt. Not the accidental kind, the deliberate kind. Dirt was insulation. Dirt was camouflage. Dirt was armor. After all, a thin film of grime did what silk could not. It filled the cracks, softened the wind, and gave your skin a kind of peasant's sheen. A healthy layer of filth could trap body oils, seal pores, and, in a way, make the skin waterproof. They didn't call it filth. They called it common sense. Children rolled in the mud as part of play. Adults earned theirs through work. By midwinter, everyone's hands bore the same dark patina, the same proof of living close to the land. Soap, where it existed, was precious, harsh, rare, and used mostly for baptisms or emergencies. Bathing in winter was a form of madness. Water meant cold. Cold meant death. Therefore, dirt meant life. It was a logic that, strangely enough, worked. And so, when the village elders looked upon a clean man in January, they didn't admire him. They worried. Clean skin meant exposure. Exposure meant foolishness. Foolishness meant the kind of cough that could end a bloodline. Better a body caked in honest soil than one polished to perish. Dirt wasn't the only weapon in the arsenal of warmth. Animal fat rendered, saved, smeared was another. Grease sealed the skin against wind, kept water from soaking in, and, as a side benefit, made one highly flammable near open flame. Shepherds were known to rub their hands, faces, and even boots with mutton fat. Hunters used boar grease. Fisherfolk used anything that didn't move fast enough to escape the pot. The smell was legendary, but it kept them alive. And in those times, survival was the highest form of beauty. Some even joked that the richest man in winter was the one who could afford to stink the most. Feet were another matter entirely. Keeping them warm was a problem unsolved by any known science. Socks, when they existed, were scraps of cloth wrapped and tied with twine. Shoes were thick leather, or, for the poorest, layers of rags and luck. Inside boots, they packed straw nature's insulation, crunchy but effective. When the straw got wet, they replaced it. When they ran out, they cursed. Some tried stuffing moss between toes. Others swore by wrapping their feet in animal hide for inward. Each person had their method, and each believed theirs was the only one that worked. But no matter how clever the solution, everyone shared the same morning ritual, waking to find their boots frozen solid, standing like monuments of suffering beside the bed. There was no sound quite like the crack of leather thawing by the fire. It would be unfair to call the peasants unfashionable. They had fashion it, just spoke a different language. It wasn't about elegance, it was about endurance. Style was measured not in color or cut, but in cleverness. The woman who managed to turn a sack into a skirt that blocked the wind was admired. The man whose cloak still had all its fastenings by February was practically a hero. And dirt, dear dirt, was not shameful. It was the color of labor, of living, of belonging. They wore it like nobles wore jewels, except their jewels smelled of smoke and goat. There's a kind of poetry in that, isn't there? The idea that beauty, in its truest form, is simply survival made visible. Bathing, when it happened, was almost religious. It required bravery, preparation, and a perfect confluence of circumstances. A warm day, enough firewood, and no urgent work to be done. Even then, it was rarely full immersion. More often, it was a careful scrubbing of visible surfaces, hands, face, maybe neck, if one was feeling extravagant. Water was fetched from wells or streams, then heated over the fire in small pots. It took forever, and by the time the water was ready, so was your regret. Children might scream at the cold shock, parents might laugh, but when it was done, there was a certain pride, a fleeting moment of cleanliness before life inevitably reasserted itself. By the next morning, soot, sweat, and straw would reclaim their rightful places, and the cycle began again. Every scent in the peasant's world told a story. Smoke meant warmth. Manure meant life. Sweat meant work. And behind it all lingered the musk of wool, of earth, of people who refused to die quietly. It wasn't pleasant, but it was honest. There was no deception, no perfume to mask the truth of living so close to the edge. In that honesty, there was dignity. They smelled of their world, and their world smelled of them, an unbreakable bond between flesh and field. If you had asked a medieval peasant whether they wished for cleaner clothes, they might have laughed. What good was a spotless tunic if you froze inside it? What comfort was fragrance when your breath turned to mist in the air? They measured worth in warmth, not whiteness. A man's cloak might be tattered, his boots muddy, his face streaked with soot, but if his children were fed and his hearth still glowed, he was as noble as any lord. And though they never called it that, their fashion was revolutionary. They took what the earth gave: wool, skin, grease, dirt, and turned it into armor. Every stain was a medal, every patch a testament. They didn't need mirrors. They had survival to prove their beauty. Over time, you stop noticing the discomfort, the itch of wool, the weight of layers, the tang of smoke. They all fade into the rhythm of living. Clothing becomes second skin. Dirt becomes memory. And even the grease on your hands becomes a mark of pride. You stop chasing cleanliness and start chasing warmth. You stop worrying about smell and start worrying about firewood. And in that shift, something remarkable happens. You make peace with the world as it is. You learn to live with it, not against it. You stop seeing dirt as corruption and start seeing it as belonging, the signature of a life lived fully, honestly, without apology. The medieval peasant's fashion sense, then, was more than practical. It was philosophical. It said, I am part of this world, not above it. And if that meant wearing the world on your skin, in every patch of soot, every smear of grease, every proud smudge of soil, then so be it. As the day brightens and the fields glitter with frost, the peasants step outside, cloaked, layered, bundled, unwashed, unbowed. Their breath clouds the air like smoke signals to the Sunday. They are not beautiful in the way of paintings or poems, but they are magnificent in the way of mountains and rivers shaped by necessity, marked by endurance. The wind bites, they pull their cloaks tighter. The mud clings, they keep walking. The world is hard, they are harder. And though no troubadour will sing of it, their clothing tells the oldest story there is. That warmth is worth any price. That dirt can be dignity. That survival, in all its messy glory, is its own kind of beauty. Evening again. The fire has quieted. The animals are settling, and the wind is tracing its old roots along the cracks of the cottage wall. Outside, the fields lie silver under frost, motionless, timeless. Inside, the family begins their nightly ritual. the gentle, determined art of making a bed out of what the earth will give. Because comfort, like luxury, was not a right, it was an invention. And the medieval peasant was an artist in invention. Forget the four-poster fantasies of noble chambers. There were no feather mattresses, no embroidered canopies, no linen sheets smelling faintly of lavender and pride. For most peasants, a bed was little more than a corner of the room and a heap of straw. Sometimes, the straw was stuffed into a large sack, stitched crudely from old cloth, a palliasse, as it was called. More often, it was spread loose upon the dirt floor, raked into a rough rectangle, and layered with rushes or hay until it rose like a low, uneven hill. If the family was lucky, they'd have a wooden frame to lift the bedding slightly off the cold ground. If not, and often not, they simply slept where the earth allowed, the straw acting as both cushion and insulation, separating flesh from frost. It wasn't softness they sought, it was survival. Straw has its own music. Lie down in it, and it sighs beneath you a dry, whispering symphony. Every movement a rustle, every shift a small storm. Children would toss and giggle, setting off crackles like tiny fireworks. The elders would grunt and mutter, trying to find that elusive, comfortable spot that didn't exist but was still worth the search. The room, when finally settled, hummed quietly, the faint creak of timbers, the soft breathing of beasts, and underneath it all, the whisper of straw. Some said it sang a dry, restless lullaby that only those born to hardship could find soothing. But to a peasant's ear, that rustle was the sound of home. It meant there was something between your bones and the frozen ground, and in winter, that was enough to feel rich. Of course, straw is not eternal. It begins golden and sweet-smelling, a comfort, a small luxury. But within weeks, it changes. The warmth of bodies, the damp of breath, the slow crumble of nightly movement all work their alchemy. The straw flattens, darkens, begins to smell faintly of damp cloth and fatigue. And so begins the cycle, the eternal changing of the bedding. Every few weeks or months, depending on courage and weather, the old straw was carried out, heavy with the ghosts of many nights, and spread across the yard to compost or feed the soil. New straw was brought in fresh, dry, light, and for one glorious evening, everyone slept as if in a field of sunshine. It didn't last, of course, but for that night, dreams came easier. The air smelled of harvest, and even the fleas seemed to rest. Ah yes, the fleas, and their more ambitious cousins, the lice. They were not guests so much as landlords ever present, unpaid and utterly unbothered by eviction notices. No amount of shaking or beating could truly remove them. They lived in the seams of tunics, in the folds of blankets, in the warm creases of the body itself. Some nights, the family would scratch in unison, like a strange nocturnal choir. And though the itch was maddening, they took it with a sort of weary humor. Better a flea's bite than a frost's, they'd say, a proverb that summed up the entire philosophy of peasant life. Besides, fleas were democratic. They bit the poor and the rich alike. In that small, irritating way, everyone was equal. And if one managed to catch a particularly plump flea between the fingers and crush it with a little snap, there was a grim satisfaction, a tiny victory in the endless war of skin and straw. Even the best straw bed could not always defeat the cold. On some nights, frost crept upward through the floor, kissing every reed, freezing the damp air trapped between stalks. The bed became crisp, almost metallic, like sleeping on winter itself. The trick was to layer it thick, and to never, under any circumstance, lie too close to the wall. Walls sweated frost. Walls breathed cold. Walls were traitors. And so the sleeping corner was carefully chosen close to the hearth, away from the draft, surrounded by bodies. The straw itself was often mixed with rushes or hay to trap heat better, or even lined beneath with an animal skin if one was fortunate. It was not luxury, but it was craft, a living experiment in thermal survival. To us, straw might seem humble, disposable, even pitiful, but to the medieval peasant, it was a gift, the softest thing the earth offered to those who asked for nothing else. It was warmth, cushion, protection. It was the thin, golden line between rest and ruin. They used it for bedding, for floors, for roofs, for shoes. When a child was born, it was laid upon straw. When a life ended, straw was laid beneath the body once more. It cradled every beginning and every end. Perhaps that's why it smelled so comforting, like a memory of safety, fragile but faithful. The bed was only one part of the equation. To sleep warm, one needed strategy. First came the straw, then the cloth, then the bodies. People slept close, sometimes 3 or 4 to a pile, wrapped in shared blankets or old cloaks. The youngest or weakest were always placed in the middle, a human hearth, protected by older, stronger shells. The rule was simple. Whoever had the broadest back slept on the edge, facing the cold. It wasn't romance. It was mathematics again, the geometry of survival. They curled like commas around each other, forming an unbroken chain of breath and warmth. Children tucked their feet beneath their parents' legs. Old hands rested on young shoulders, and somewhere between straw and skin, heat gathered like secret fire. If you listened closely, you could hear it, not just the breathing, but the rhythm of life refusing to surrender. Of course, it wasn't peaceful. Sleep, in a peasant house, was not the silent kind. There were snores of various timbers, low, rumbling, sputtering, the shifting of animals, the occasional cough that echoed through the rafters, and always the rustle of straw beneath the constant choreography of restless dreamers. Sometimes a child would wake crying, and a mother's voice would rise in the dark, soft, soothing, half prayer, half lullaby. Sometimes a cow would shuffle, and the bed tremble in sympathy. Sometimes the roof would sigh, and everyone would whisper a quick thanks that it still held. It was not silence, but something better: continuity. The sound of a world still alive, still turning. The mind, mercifully, could wander farther than the cold could reach. And in those long nights, the peasants dreamed richly of sunlight, of green fields, of bread thick as a hand, of laughter unchoked by frost. Sometimes dreams were shared aloud in the morning, around the rekindled fire. A daughter might dream of walking barefoot again. A father might dream of a summer rain that smelled of honey. A grandmother might claim she saw angels sleeping in the rafters, dusted in straw. Dreams were warmth of a different kind, fleeting, but bright enough to carry them through another night. And when the dream was good, the day that followed seemed less cruel. To enter a peasant's sleeping corner was to step into a world of scent, straw, smoke, sweat, hay, and the faint sweetness of wool. It was not perfumed, but it was alive. That smell was the signature of winter survival, earthy, honest, eternal. To modern noses it might seem rough, but to them it meant safety. It meant another night survived, another dawn earned. Even the animals added their notes. The hay-scented cow, the dusty goat, the pig's soft musk, it all mingled into one fragrance, the perfume of persistence. In the middle of it all, beneath layers of straw and cloth and fatigue, was something quiet but profound: togetherness. They may have slept on dirt, but they did not sleep alone. They shared warmth, breath, heartbeat. They shared discomfort and laughter and whispered stories before sleep. Each night, they rebuilt what the day had worn down, not with stone or fire, but with presence. The bed was not just a place to rest. It was a pact, an unspoken promise that no one would face the cold alone. And in that, they found something greater than comfort. They found belonging. When morning finally crept in, the first light always touched the straw first. It glowed not the way gold glows, but the way memory does, soft and forgiving. Someone stirred, stretching stiff limbs. The straw whispered back. The fire crackled awake. Animals shuffled, and the smell of smoke and hay filled the air once more. The night had been cold, yes, but they were still here. And that, to them, was victory enough. The bed, humble as it was, had done its duty. It had held them, warmed them, carried their dreams, absorbed their fears. It was both cradle and shield, woven from the harvest that had sustained them all along. By day, it might be raked aside to make space for work or eating or mending. By night, it would return the ever-faithful nest, waiting quietly to gather its people again. To modernize, such living might seem pitiful. But if you could step back into that dim room, hear the laughter before sleep, smell the warmth of straw, feel the faint rise and fall of breath beside you, you'd understand. It wasn't pity that belonged there. It was reverence. Because within that simplicity, that poverty, was a kind of truth the world has almost forgotten. That comfort is not luxury, but closeness. That warmth does not come from things, but from each other. And that sometimes the smallest mercy, a dry bed of straw, is enough to keep the great miracle of life going one more day. The peasants knew this. They didn't need words for it. They lived it every night, in the soft golden hush between earth and sky, between frost and fire, between one breath and the next. Morning comes gray and reluctant, as if the sky itself has second thoughts. The hearth sighs. The straw beds are raked smooth. The animals snort, shake, and begin their noisy negotiations with breakfast. And then, before the day's work calls them to field or forest, the peasant turns to the other great battle of winter, not against hunger, not against cold itself, but against the wind that creeps in uninvited. Because no matter how thick the cloak, no matter how fine the fire, there was always that thin, invisible enemy, the draft. It came through cracks in the wall, whispered beneath the door, slithered down from the roof like a ghost with icy fingers. And the peasants, stubborn souls that they were, declared war on it daily, armed with nothing but mud, moss, rags, and determination. This was the draft battle, fought not with swords but with soft things. The wind had no mercy. It prowled the countryside, searching for any weakness in the humble huts of the poor. It found them easily. A medieval cottage was not built for elegance. It was built for survival, and sometimes only just. Walls of wattle and daub, a noble phrase for what was essentially sticks, smeared with mud and dung, cracked under frost. The thatched roof, golden in summer, turned traitorous in winter, dripping meltwater or letting in slivers of moonlight. The floor, hardened earth, shifted and split, letting cold crawl up like a second shadow. Everywhere, the world wanted in. And so, the peasants learned to fight back not with perfection, but with persistence. Their tools were humble, but their ingenuity was legendary. They stuffed moss into wall gaps, wedged straw beneath doors, plastered mud into holes with bare hands. A torn cloak became a door curtain. A worn tunic became insulation. Old rags, scraps of wool, even bits of animal hide were repurposed, pressed, jammed, tied, layered, anything to keep the breath of the outside world where it belonged. If it's soft or squishy, they said, stuff it in the cracks. It wasn't elegance, but it was effective. Children learned early that when the wind howled, you looked for movement, a flutter in the curtain, a tremor in the candle flame. That was the draft revealing itself, and where there was a draft, there was a mission. Mothers sent them scurrying with bits of cloth or handfuls of mud. They'd plug, patch, pat, and step back proudly to watch the curtain go still again. It was a game, almost. A kind of domestic heroism that no one sang about but everyone relied upon. Mud was the peasants' miracle material. It built their walls, sealed their homes, and saved their fingers from freezing winds. It was free, forgiving, and infinitely reusable. A bit of straw mixed in made it stronger. A touch of dung made it last longer. They'd knead it like bread, slap it against the cracks, and smooth it with the same care one might give to icing a cake, though the flavor, thankfully, was different. When it dried, it formed a brittle skin that kept the wind at bay, at least for a while. Then, when the frost cracked it again, they patched once more. Their homes were living things, constantly shedding, healing, growing. By spring, the walls were a patchwork of repairs, each smear of mud a signature of someone's hand. You could almost read the story of a family in those layers winters endured. Storms survived, years marked not by calendars but by coats of earth. Where mud couldn't reach, moss took over. Moss was nature's blanket, soft and forgiving, growing wherever dampness lingered. It lined the edges of doors, filled gaps between roof beams, even cushioned the edges of window shutters. Its scent, green, sweet, slightly wild, gave the air a hint of forest inside the home. A reminder that not all the world outside wished them harm. Children gathered it in baskets, pulling it gently from stones and roots. Mothers stuffed it into the walls, murmuring thanks under their breath. Sometimes, in the heart of winter, when everything else was dead and brown, that patch of moss remained vividly alive, a small, defiant piece of spring refusing to leave. If hope had a texture, it would feel like that. Soft, damp, and determined. Ah, the roof, that fickle guardian between heaven and hearth. Thatched roofs were marvels of simplicity. Bundles of straw layered thickly and tied to wooden beams, angled steep enough to shed rain, but never quite enough to keep all of it out. Over time, birds stole pieces for their nests. The sun baked the straw brittle, and rain made it sag. And when winter came, the roof joined the enemy's side. A peasant lying in bed might hear it sigh and drip tiny droplets pattering rhythmically onto the floor, or worse, onto a sleeping face. Buckets were set strategically to catch the leaks, creating a symphony of dripping water that played all through the night. Still, they patched. When the thaw came, the men climbed up, weaving new straw into the roof, sealing holes with clay and prayer. It was slow, tedious work, but when they finished, and the first rain slid harmlessly down the thatch instead of through it, there was celebration, laughter, relief, pride. You could measure happiness in that sound. The silence of a roof doing its job. The door, too, was a battlefield. Most were simple wooden planks, swollen with damp or shrunken from dry cold. They rarely fit snugly. The wind found every edge, every keyhole, every gap beneath the sill. To fight back, families hung thick curtains or old cloaks across the doorway. Sometimes, a spare sheep's hide, wool inward, was nailed up for extra warmth, and still the wind found its way in. It hissed, whistled, sighed, an unwanted lullaby. So they stuffed the bottom edge with straw, sealed the sides with rags, and laid stones against the threshold. And when all that failed, they simply moved their beds closer to the fire and glared at the door until spring. There was something almost philosophical about it, this endless battle with invisible air. The peasants knew they could never win, not truly. There would always be another crack, another breeze, another night when the wind seemed to laugh as it slipped in anyway. But that didn't stop them, because the point wasn't victory. It was defiance. Every patched hole, every handful of mud, every rag stuffed into a crevice was a declaration. You will not take this warmth from me. They didn't fight for comfort. They fought for continuity. For the right to wake up tomorrow and patch again. For the stubborn belief that a human hand, however rough, could still hold back the world a little longer. The draft, in its way, became a teacher, a reminder that life itself was a constant repair. You fix what you can, you endure what you can't, and you do it again, and again, and again. By midwinter, every home in the village looked like a collage of improvisation. Walls bulged where too much mud had been added. Windows were half covered with fabric, animal skins, or paper smeared with grease to let in light but block the wind. The roofline bristled with straw in every direction, a kind of rustic crown. And yet there was beauty in it. Each patch, each repair, each crooked beam spoke of life's persistence. It was not the cold, perfect symmetry of stone halls, it was the living warmth of imperfection. Their homes were like their souls, cracked, patched, weary but still standing. Once the day's patching was done, and the fire lit anew, the house transformed. Outside, the world froze in silence. Inside, the air shimmered faintly with heat, the patched walls holding it close. The smell of moss and smoke mingled. The glow of the hearth flickered against the mud walls, turning them gold. A child pressed a palm against the new patch, testing it, feeling the faint warmth stay inside. It was victory small, fleeting but real. And as they sat together by the fire, the wind rattling faintly at the door, there was a sense of quiet triumph. Let the world rage, the house would hold, at least for tonight. There's something beautiful in the way they refused to give up, in how each repair became a ritual, each smear of mud a prayer. They didn't have architects or artisans. They had instinct. They didn't seek perfection. They sought peace. And though the cold always returned, though the wind always found its way in again, still they worked, still they patched, still they hoped. Maybe that's what makes the story of these winters so quietly heroic. It wasn't about triumph. It was about persistence. It was about hands that never stopped working, even when numb, even when tired, even when the cracks came back the next day. The draft battle was never truly won, but every night they held it off was a victory that mattered. When the first light of dawn finally touched those patched walls, it filtered through layers of fabric and moss and mud. The light wasn't clean, it came softened, dappled, almost tender. It painted the room in muted golds and greens, the colors of earth and effort. The house, for all its flaws, glowed like something holy. Not because it was perfect, but because it had survived. And the people inside, wrapped in their patched cloaks, sitting beside their faithful fire, smiled softly, watching the world wake up outside. The wind would come again. The cracks would widen. But so would their resolve. They would gather the mud, the moss, the rags once more. They would fight the draft again. Because that's what life was, not the absence of cold, but the courage to keep patching warmth back into it. If it's soft or squishy, they said, stuff it in the cracks. It sounds like humor, and it was, but it was also wisdom, disguised in laughter. Because in those few words lay the entire philosophy of peasant survival. Use what you have, fix what you can, keep the cold out, or at least keep it waiting. And maybe that's all any human has ever done. From mud huts to modern walls, we're still patching, still insulating, still fighting the same drafts, not just of air, but of time, fear, loss, and longing. The medieval peasant simply did it with better honesty. Their cracks showed, their fixes were visible, their lives were rough but real, a handmade fortress against the endless wind. As night returns and the family gathers once more around the hearth, the patched house creaks softly in the cold. The fire glows, the moss hums faintly in the walls, and the wind sighs outside like a disappointed ghost. Inside, there is warmth. It isn't much, but it's theirs. And in that flickering light, surrounded by imperfection held together with mud and love, something eternal whispers that defiance, however small, is still a form of beauty. that even the poorest home, patched and crooked and breathing smoke, can hold the richest kind of peace. Because survival, like a well-sealed wall, is never about keeping everything out. It's about holding enough warmth within to last until morning. By the time the last crack in the wall was stuffed with moss and the final log heaved onto the hearth, darkness had already claimed the world outside. Winter nights arrived early and stayed far too long, stretching across the hours like a wool blanket full of holes. The peasants knew that once the sun dipped, they were entering a different kind of labor, the work of staying alive until dawn. The first duty of night was firekeeping. Someone always drew the short straw literally. The chosen watcher dozed by the embers with a stick in hand, prodding the logs whenever they dared fade. Families rotated the watch. Grandparents, with their light sleep, took the early hours. Mothers or older children relieved them when the moon wheeled higher. It wasn't only about warmth, it was about faith. As long as the hearth glowed, life continued. If the fire died, morning might never come for anyone. The watchers learned to dream with one eye open. They listened to the breathing of sleepers, to the sighs of the roof, to the low hum of wind at the door. Each crackle was reassurance, each hiss a warning. Sometimes a watcher nodded off too deeply, and the room grew suddenly colder. In that instant, everyone woke at once, sensing the chill the way animals sense danger. A scramble followed sparks, smoke, muttered prayers, then flame again, weak but living. Relief settled like a blanket. Sleep was never solid. It came in patches, stitched together by duty. Even breathing required strategy. Cold air could slice the lungs raw, so peasants mastered a strange, shallow rhythm breathing through the nose, slow and small, warming each breath before it reached the chest. Children were taught early, breathe like a mouse, not a bear. The saying was half joke, half medicine. The less air you gulped, the less warmth you lost. In the dim light, you could watch the mist of their breath rise and fade, a quiet choreography of survival. They looked like monks in prayer, every exhalation a soft offering to the cold gods outside. And it worked. They lived on those careful breaths, conserving heat the way they conserved everything else economically, reverently, without waste. Before lying down, they ate, always. The evening meal was the most important defense against the night. Heavy stews, thick with barley, onions, turnips, maybe a scrap of salted meat if fortune smiled. They called it belly fire. A full stomach burned slow and hot, like a banked hearth inside the body. The children called it magic. Eat your soup, it'll chase the frost. There was science hidden in that superstition, though they'd never call it that. The calories became warmth, the warmth became sleep. So they ladled, chewed, sighed, and leaned back with the contentment of small victories. Even when food ran thin, they stretched it with imagination. Thin gruel thickened with roots, broth flavored by hope. What mattered was ritual, the act of eating together, of reminding one another they were still alive enough to need a meal. After supper came the ancient ceremony of warming the bed. Smooth river stones were heated near the fire until they glowed faintly, then wrapped in cloth or buried in hay inside wooden boxes. These hay boxes, primitive hot water bottles, were tucked into straw beds to chase away the first bite of cold. Children loved them, calling them sun rocks. They passed the stones from hand to hand, giggling at the heat until their palms tingled. In truth, the warmth faded quickly, but the comfort lingered longer. For a few precious minutes, the bed felt almost luxurious, soft, fragrant with hay, radiating a stolen memory of summer. The old would sometimes whisper to their stones as they placed them under the blankets, half joking that they were tucking in a friend who never complained, never snored, and never stole the covers. The hearth was the true center of night. The weak and sick slept nearest its glow. The strong took the edges. Babies were placed beside mothers, wrapped in cloaks, Faces turned away from smoke. There was an art to arranging bodies for warmth, an ever-changing geometry of need. If someone fell ill, they were moved inward. If a guest arrived half frozen, the family shuffled wordlessly, making space near the embers. The hearth itself was rarely still. Even in sleep, someone would stir, shift a log, whisper a name. It was a living presence protector, companion, sometimes judge. Too much neglect and it punished with cold, too much feeding and it devoured the fuel meant for tomorrow. Balance was everything. Before the final embers dimmed, prayers began. Quiet, rhythmic, half murmured into the dark. They prayed for warmth, for mercy, for the saints who knew what it was to shiver. Street blaze guarded throats, street Apollonia teeth. But on freezing nights, every saint was drafted into service. Candles guttered on small altars, tiny fires pleading with the Great One above. Faith did what fire could not. It warmed the spirit. To believe that angels kept watch when you could not, that was another kind of insulation. Sometimes neighbors joined, voices blending into a low chant that filled the room like wool fills a cloak. Prayer was heat shared through sound. No one survived a medieval winter alone. When a cottage roof collapsed under snow, the village came running. When a widow's fire went out, someone carried embers from their own hearth cupped in a pot. To deny warmth was to invite curses. To give, it was to store blessings for leaner times. Communal nights happened, often families sleeping shoulder to shoulder in one house during blizzards. Animals and humans tangled in one great breathing mass. Privacy was a concept for warmer months. In winter, survival trumped modesty, and though the smell was indescribable, so was the comfort. Laughter rose among the coughing. Stories circled between the snores, and for a few hours, even misery felt shared, therefore smaller. After the prayers faded and the fire sank low, there came that peculiar hour when the world seemed to pause. Outside, frost creaked on the thatch. Inside, only breathing moved. It was then that thoughts wandered to fields buried in snow, to lost harvests, to the faint hope of spring. Some whispered plans aloud just to hear them spoken, as if speech itself could promise a future. This silence was not empty. It was the sound of endurance gathering itself for morning. Not every night ended in laughter. There were winters when the frost was hungrier than the people. A failed harvest, an illness, a misplaced ember, and the morning found stillness that no one dared break. Neighbors discovered families huddled together, frozen in their sleep, faces peaceful as if they'd simply drifted deeper into dreaming. The villagers buried them when the ground thawed, speaking softly of mercy, of how the cold had been too strong even for saints. Yet even in grief, life went on. Someone always lit another fire. Someone always mended another wall. Because despair, like cold, could only win if left unchallenged. For those who woke again, each dawn was proof of triumph. They rose stiff, smoke-scented, hair matted with straw, and smiled anyway. The hearth still smoked. The walls still stood. The children still breathed. They didn't call it heroism, but that's what it was. Quiet, repetitive heroism performed in the dark, with mud on their hands and hope on their lips. Winter taught them that survival was not a solitary act. It was a chorus, every breath, every shared bowl of stew, every watchful night adding its note to the song of endurance. If you had asked them, they would have laughed at the notion of philosophy, yet they lived one all the same. Keep the fire, feed the body, trust the saints, share the heat, everything else comfort, beauty. Even joy was built on that foundation. Perhaps that's why, in their rough, smoke-darkened cottages, they still found room for laughter. The absurd jokes about frostbitten toes, the teasing of whoever snored loudest, the stories that grew wilder with every retelling, all of it was warmth too. Humor, faith, and stubbornness formed the triple braid that held them through the season. When the pale light finally touched the room, Catching on the soot-black beams, the long night ended with a sigh rather than a cheer. Someone yawned, someone stretched, someone reached for the pot to coax breakfast from yesterday's stew. The watcher by the fire rubbed their eyes, proud to see the coals still glowing. The others murmured thanks to God, to the wood, to the sheer luck of being alive one more day. Outside, frost glittered like shattered glass, but inside, there was motion again. The shuffle of feet, the hiss of water meeting heat, the small, steady sounds of life continuing. And above it all, the same old wind pressed at the door, curious, persistent, forever testing. The peasants smiled at its familiar voice. Not today, their patched walls seemed to say. We're still here. So ended each winter night, not with comfort, but with continuity. The cycle of patching, feeding, praying, breathing, it was never broken. And that unbroken rhythm became its own kind of fire, one that burned quietly inside the heart long after the embers cooled. In the end, their greatest invention was not the haybox or the moss-stuffed wall. It was community, the shared warmth of bodies and belief. And though centuries have passed and our walls no longer leak wind, we still fight the same darkness. We still gather around small fires, screens, lamps, stories to remind ourselves that warmth, wherever it glows, is sacred. The medieval peasants knew it best. Night always comes, but so does morning. And between the two, humanity keeps watch. The fire is low now. The long winter tale has been told, and its embers glow faintly soft as breath, quiet as memory. Outside, the snow lies deep and forgiving, wrapping the world in silence. Inside, only warmth remains, the kind that hums not in the air, but in the heart. It is time, perhaps, to rest. But before we drift into sleep, let us linger a little while in gratitude for those who came before, for those who endured. Every comfort we know, every blanket, every furnace, every steaming cup on a winter's night has roots in their struggle. The peasants of old, with their chapped hands and soot-darkened walls, built the foundations of what we now take for granted. They didn't invent comfort out of luxury. They discovered it in necessity. A patch of moss in a wall became the first insulation. A banked ember became the ancestor of the modern heater. A shared bed became the quiet blueprint of communal care. Their lives were small only in size, never in spirit. Each act of endurance, every repaired wall, every night spent whispering stories beside a dying fire. These were the building blocks of civilization itself. We live, quite literally, in the warmth they learned to keep. What they lacked in tools, they replaced with creativity. A cracked wall was not a failure, it was an invitation to invent. They learned that mud could be stronger than pride, that straw could be softer than despair. They understood that survival was not an art of grand gestures, but of small, clever mercies repeated endlessly. The world we inhabit, the one sealed against drafts and bright with light, is their quiet victory made visible. Our homes are their hope perfected. Each pane of glass, each insulated wall, each furnace hum carries their fingerprints in its design. Their wisdom, passed hand to hand through the centuries, became the pulse of human progress. Make do, adapt, keep the fire alive. Perhaps their greatest invention was not material at all. It was the understanding that survival is a shared act. No one endured winter alone. They gathered. They shared warmth. They split bread and laughter in equal measure. In their closeness, they discovered something sacred, something more enduring than fire. That same spirit lives on in us now, even if the fires have changed form. When storms cut power and neighbors share candles, when strangers offer blankets in the cold, when families gather close, not out of need, but out of love, that is their legacy breathing still. The peasant's lesson was simple, and yet eternal. Warmth is not owned. It is given, And in giving, it grows. They never sought to conquer winter. They learned to live with it. The cold became their teacher, a stern, silent philosopher reminding them of balance. It taught humility, that the earth could not be mastered, only respected. It taught patience, that spring comes not by demand but by endurance. It taught faith, that warmth, however small, was always worth tending. And in those lessons lay a wisdom far older than comfort. It told them what we, in our well-heated rooms, sometimes forget, that fragility and strength are the same thread, woven together in the fabric of being human. If you listen closely on a winter's night, when the world is still and your room hums softly with quiet warmth, you can almost hear them. The echo of the straw rustling, the low murmur of prayers, the laughter tucked between coughs and sighs. They are still there, those peasants of long ago, keeping watch beside the hearth, checking the cracks, banking the fire. Their hands built the rhythm of survival, and we have inherited its song. Every home, every heart that refuses to freeze, carries a bit of their flame. And though centuries have drifted like snow between us, their breath still warms the air we breathe. We are the continuation of their long night's labor, the descendants of endurance. Every cozy winter night we enjoy today, the hum of the radiator, the glow of a candle, the comfort of fleece and tea, is not simply modern luxury. It is gratitude in disguise. Because once, long ago, warmth was a miracle. It had to be built, fed, guarded, prayed for. It had to be shared, or it would vanish. So tonight, as the world outside curls into cold and sleep, remember this: you are living inside the dream of someone who once shivered in the dark and still chose to believe in morning. They did not have our words for hope, but they had the shape of it, the act of keeping the ember alive, even when the night seemed endless. That was their language. That was their prayer. There are no songs written for the peasant who patched the wall at midnight, no statues for the mother who breathed warmth into her child's frozen hands. And yet, their heroism endures, woven through the centuries in every humble act of care that keeps the cold at bay. It was not grand, but it was eternal. It lived in repetition, in the stirring of stew, the mending of roofs, the sharing of breath. It lived in faith that small efforts could defy a vast world. And in that quiet defiance, humanity learned its most vital art, to persist beautifully. Now, as the tale closes and the fire of memory dims, we return to stillness. The peasant's world fades into the soft dark of time, but the glow remains. A whisper of smoke, a hint of straw, a trace of warmth that lingers beneath the skin of the world. Their story is not just history, it is inheritance. Every sigh of wind against a window, every shiver that sends us reaching for a blanket, every smile exchanged across a firelit room, it all remembers them. They remind us that comfort is never free, that it is born from courage, and that even the smallest flame, tended faithfully, can outlast the coldest night. So let us honor them, not with monuments, but with mindfulness. Each time we strike a match, light a candle, sip something warm, or fall asleep safely wrapped in quiet heat, let us think of them. The nameless hands that built warmth out of nothing, the breath that refused to stop, the heartbeat that pulsed against the frost saying, "Not yet, not tonight," because that, in the end, is the legacy they left us. Not wealth, nor art, nor glory, but resilience. A resilience that hums softly beneath every comfort we know. A resilience that asks nothing but remembrance. And if, as you close your eyes now, the world feels still and safe and warm, know that it is their fire, burning still, one ember, one breath, one heartbeat at a time.